Hey guys, I'm back by the fire and I have another awesome story to share with you. Today's story is this epic survival story, and I mean the story itself is truly unbelievable, but I'm telling you, the twist at the end, basically how this person was able to survive, you will not see coming. Great plot twist, great story, I know you're gonna like it. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to come on down to your campfire. But when they get there, just immediately push them into the flames and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 10 a.m. on March 18, 1944, a 26-year-old Finnish soldier named Aimo Koivunen sat around a campfire with a group of other soldiers inside of the Arctic Circle in Northern Europe. They were very deep into the wilderness in this forest that was covered in several feet of snow, and Aimo was melting a pot of that snow over the fire so the group could drink some tea. And at the same time that Aimo was doing this, even though it was kind of relaxing to be sitting here, Aimo, his whole body was basically aching. Number one, it was 5 degrees outside, and this was also the first time that he and the other soldiers had stopped to rest in about 2 days. They had been on the move the whole time. At this point, during World War II, they were allied with Nazi Germany. Not because, they were Nazis, they were not, but because Finland and Germany shared a common enemy, the Soviet Union. Right now, Aimo and his squadron were in an area called Lapland, which used to belong to Finland. But 4 years earlier, the Soviet Union had invaded Finland and ultimately forced Finland to cede this land to the Soviets. But now, during World War II, Finland wanted to get their land back, and Germany was helping them do that. And so Aimo and his squadron were in Lapland on essentially a reconnaissance mission. They were there to try to figure out sort of what the Soviets were doing in this part of Lapland and how many Soviets were out there, again, in this particular part of Lapland. However, Aimo and the others had spent the past 2 days skiing all over the place in their area of operations, but so far, they hadn't seen any Soviet soldiers or any Soviet bases. But, for Aimo, and probably for the other soldiers that he was with, this was ultimately a good thing. They were trained for combat, but they didn't necessarily want to come across Soviets and have like a full-blown shootout, in part because the Soviets were just a bigger, more well-equipped military. And, they were also more advanced, and so if they got into a gunfight with them, who knows what would have happened. And so even though Aimo is like sitting here feeling very sore and very tired as he melts his snow, he was ultimately feeling kind of grateful that this reconnaissance mission had proven to be pretty low-key. However, just as the water began to boil, Aimo and the other soldiers heard the unmistakable sound of machine gun fire coming from somewhere that had to be nearby. And so immediately, Aimo and the others, they jump up, forget what they're doing, and they're looking to see where this gunfire is coming from. But then before they could even make sense of the situation, Aimo's lieutenant yelled like, "Hey, get ready, get your guns!" And so they all scooped up their weapons. Aimo, he's picking his weapon up, and as he looks up, he looked off in the distance, maybe a quarter mile away, and he was shocked to see an entire pack of Soviet soldiers bearing down on them. They were literally skiing down this mountainside right nearby, and they were obviously shooting their machine guns, not in random directions, but right at Aimo and the other men. They were clearly being attacked by these Soviets. Now, Aimo and the other men have clearly been trained for this. This is literally why they're out here. They are soldiers. They're ready for this type of encounter. But for a moment, when Aimo sees this overwhelming force that's descending on them, they're clearly outnumbered, like this is going to end badly. All Aimo had in his head was just this overwhelming feeling of just terror. He was the oldest of 6 children, And when he first enlisted in the military, he had promised all of his little siblings that he wouldn't get hurt. He would come home. He would be okay. And now he knew that wasn't going to happen. Like, he was going to get killed. He just knew it. But at this point, IMO, he looked over at his lieutenant to get orders. But IMO, after sort of breaking out of this initial thought, he looked over at his lieutenant, and his lieutenant looked terrified too. But he quickly composed himself and yelled for IMO and everybody else to flee. Just moments later, IMO and the other Finnish soldiers were on their skis, skiing as fast as they could away from the Soviets down the backside of this mountain, just doing anything they could to survive. And as IMO is skiing away, he can hear the sound of gunfire ricocheting off trees, zipping by his head. Like, he's thinking, at any point, I'm going to get hit, or one of my teammates are going to get hit. There's nothing we can do. We just got to go as fast and as far as we can. And so he's skiing, and actually IMO was at the front of their formation. So he's actually leading the pack. And so really it was his job to kind of create tracks in the snow that the others could follow in behind. It was easier for them. But it meant he was expending a lot of energy, basically pushing all the snow down as he was making his escape. And as much as he wanted to maintain that position and do this for his teammates, to continue to make tracks here, it was so exhausting. And also, like, when you're in combat, you have this unbelievable adrenaline rush that sometimes can lead to like a massive crash of energy. And it was like he had this huge rush of energy, and now it's like he's collapsing. Despite the need to escape here, it's like his body just cannot go any faster than he's going. And so before long, it's like he found himself slowing down, and his teammates are zipping by him because they can't stop. The bullets are flying fast. Like, their only hope of survival is just to keep on going. And so IMO knows that, like, basically, if he can't keep up, he's dead. But his body, it was just, he couldn't go any faster. He was slowing down. He was going slower and slower. He could hear the sound of the gunfire getting closer and closer, and he's thinking about his siblings and how devastated they're going to be to find out that he was killed in this war. And so slower and slower he's going. The sounds are getting louder and louder behind him, and he sees the last of his teammates pass him, and he sees them just kind of drift off down the mountain into the white abyss beyond, and they're gone. He's alone, and he just can't keep up. And then finally he just loses control of his skis. He veers off to the side. He starts tumbling down the mountain, smashes into a tree, and he passes out. When IMO woke up, it was light outside. But he had no idea how much time had passed. He also really had no idea how he was even still alive. Like, what, did the Soviets just decide not to kill me? Or did they not see me? Like, what happened to my teammates? Like, what's going on? He had a lot of questions. But in addition to feeling confused about the whole situation, he also had this really distinct other feeling. He had this immense sense of being alert, like hyper alert, more than really he had ever been in his whole life. It's like he could hear and see everything at like a 10 times level. It's like, oh my God, I know everything going on around me. I'm totally aware. So with his like hyper vigilance that he suddenly was having sort of out of nowhere, he began to, take stock of his situation. Right away, he, was able to see that he's alone. Like, the Soviets are not nearby. He's not like being held captive. And again, his comrades are nowhere to be seen. So he's alone in the middle of the Arctic Circle, in the middle of the wilderness, which is quite bad. But he also could see that, okay, well, I still have my skis, so I can still get around. He still had his boots on. He still had his equipment on. Like, he had the things he needed to survive. He even had his compass still, which had been in his hand, but he hadn't lost it. And so he had a way to navigate. And he had his weapon still. And so he's thinking, okay, the situation's bad, but I have what I need to survive for some time. And he also realized that, sort of amazingly, despite clearly crashing as a minimum and smashing into this tree that he was laying near, despite that, he didn't feel any pain in his body. And he didn't appear to have any injuries. So he's thinking, what a miracle here, that the worst thing that's happened here is I've basically been abandoned and I'm effectively lost, but it could be worse. And so IMO, after taking stock of his situation, he stood up and just began looking all around him. And again, he has this hypervigilance thing going on, which, he's thinking is, the product of a huge adrenaline rush from nearly dying maybe. But either way, he's hyper aware and he's looking around. and he notices off in the distance, maybe like 6-7 miles away, there's this mountain that immediately looks familiar to him. It looks like the mountain that he and his squadron had agreed would be their rendezvous point if they got separated. And so he's looking at it thinking that's got to be it. And then he sees on this mountain, as he's kind of squinting and staring at this mountain, he sees what appears to be smoke coming off the mountain. And he's thinking, that's it. That's where my teammates have gone. Like, they haven't abandoned me. They've gone to the rendezvous point. They're going to wait for me. I just need to get to that mountain. I got my skis. I got my equipment. I don't think I'm hurt. I can do it. I'm going to get over there and I'll be saved. So Aimo scooped up his backpack and picked up his gun and whatever other equipment he had on the ground. And then he started skiing towards this mountain. And for a while, he just kept on staring up at the smoke coming off the mountain, making sure he was going in the right direction. And as he got closer, he was nearly positive he could see that in addition to the smoke, he could see what appeared to be little lean-to tents on the mountainside, which were telltale signs that those were Finnish soldiers. That's how they set up their tents. So he's thinking, this is it. Like, I'm going to be saved. I just got to get there. And he had so much energy, maybe, because he was so close to being rescued or something, but he felt like this huge surge of energy. It was like nothing could make him tired. And then finally, Aimo got close enough to this campsite on the side of this mountain that he actually could see faces. He could see the other soldiers, and they were his, Finnish comrades. They had clearly gone to the rendezvous point, and they hadn't seen him yet. And so here he is, feeling like full of energy. He's barreling towards them, and he starts calling out to them. He's thinking they're going to be like totally shocked that, anybody would just come out of the wilderness towards their campsite, let alone Aimo, who they must have assumed by this point was dead. Also, he's thinking, I don't want them to shoot at me, thinking I'm a Soviet soldier, so I better get their attention. And so he's yelling out for his comrades. And at some point, one of the men, they turn and they see Aimo, and their reaction is not what Aimo wanted. Their reaction was being really shocked, grabbing their weapon, and shooting at him. And before long, all these soldiers, all of his comrades, are opening fire on Aimo. And Aimo's like, come on, like, I'm one of you, what are you doing? But he's already going so fast, skiing so fast, that his only move was to basically ski right down the middle of their camp and just go to the other side of the mountain. And so he literally skied through this campsite with all of his comrades shooting at him, who miraculously missed him. So he doesn't get shot somehow. The bullets are whizzing past his head. And he's thinking, oh my gosh, they think I'm a Soviet. Come on, I'm calling out to you guys. I'm not a Soviet. But he barrels past them, and then after he's pretty far away from this campsite, he's yelling back to them like, guys, it's me, it's Aimo, what are you doing? But they're yelling and they're shooting in his direction, and so he had no choice but to just keep on skiing away from them, away from safety, or what he believed was going to be safety. And so on he went for hours and hours, just skiing and skiing away from this ambush, if you will. And the whole time he's thinking, like, what happened? Even if they shot at me at first, couldn't they have figured it out that, like, I'm one of you? Like, wouldn't you have realized that eventually as I skied right through your campsite? I have the same uniform as you. I have the same weapon as you. You recognize me? Like, what was that? And so he has no idea what happened, but he's like, how do I have so much energy? Like, how am I able to do this? I've been skiing for hours and hours and hours. I've been shot at so many times. Like, this is surreal. What's happening? Like, what is going on here? And so Aimo just continued skiing for hours and hours until it was abundantly clear he was not in shooting range. He didn't hear the sound of any gunfire. Like, he's safe again. Still very confused why this was even happening, but he's safe. The sun's gone down, and so he thinks, like, okay, I need to stop. I need to make camp. I need to regroup. But it was at this point that he's thinking to himself, like, I haven't eaten anything. I haven't had any water. I've basically been at a full sprint, like skiing at a full sprint here for practically the whole day. I've had multiple near-death experiences. I smashed into a tree during that initial, skirmish. But I feel great. I feel like I have more energy than I've ever had in my whole life. And so he's just caught by, like, how am I able to do this? Is this what it's like when you're in a true survival situation? Like, your body just goes into, like, overdrive or something? Like, he couldn't understand it. And so he's standing there, like, basically telling himself, you really need to stop. Even though you have the energy to go pretty much indefinitely, you need to stop, you need to make a fire, you need to have food, you need to have water, you need to rest. But it was like he was he was forcing himself to do these things. He didn't feel compelled to do them. It was like, oh, that's right, I need to like do human stuff. And so that's what he did. He stopped, he built a fire, he made some food, and he's like not hungry at all, but he's eating the food, forcing himself to. He's having some water. And then he's like, okay, I'll rest, and then in the morning I'll figure out what to do next. But he lays down to go to sleep, and he should have been completely exhausted, but he wasn't. He couldn't even sleep, like not at all. He just laid there completely wide awake as the wind and sleet and snow whipped all around him, and he just laid there, again, feeling great, but just not tired at all. The next morning, when the sun came up, Aimo had not slept at all, but still he was able to get up, put his skis on, and get his stuff and continue skiing, basically in the direction that he believed would bring him back to Finland. And as he was skiing, he's thinking to himself, it's kind of interesting because when he first got attacked by the Soviets, it was like his mind was clear, but his body failed him. Like his legs got so tired from trying to cut those tracks in the snow that he fell off and crashed. And that sort of led him to this position. But now, for whatever reason, it was like his mind was delirious. Like he couldn't keep his thoughts straight, but his body was like a Terminator. Like he just kept on going no matter what. And so he just kept on skiing, almost like without even thinking. His body was like on autopilot. And so all day that day, Aimo just skied in one direction and just didn't stop. And the whole time he's skiing, he didn't see another soul. He is out in the middle of, the Arctic Circle. There's no more Soviets. There's no more teammates, nothing. He's just out in the middle of the wilderness. And realistically, he didn't know if he was even remotely going in the right direction, but he was just going to go. But that night, as he's still just skiing in a straight line, not stopping, sort of unbelievably, he looked up ahead and he saw somebody, the first person he had seen since, the ambush at the campsite. And even more unbelievable is the person he saw was one of his teammates. It was this guy named Matty. He was a comrade of his. They had been together when the Soviets had first attacked. And so immediately Aimo's thinking, like, clearly Matty got separated as well, and it's just serendipity that we have wound up at the same place. And so Aimo, he skis right up to Matty, and he's waving him down. He's so relieved to see him. And Matty, when he looks over at Aimo, he doesn't shoot at him, but he sort of tells him to, like, be quiet, like, calm down. And he kind of beckons him over. And when Aimo comes up next to Matty, he has all these questions, like, what do we do? Where are we going? But Matty just tells him, like, just to be quiet, and then gestures to lay down on the ground. And so Aimo doesn't really know what's going on here, but he trusts Matty. Matty is not shooting at him. That was a good sign. And so the two of them just laid in the snow. They laid down right there. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Aimo was able to feel tired enough that when he closed his eyes, he did drift off to sleep almost right away. When Aimo woke back up again, he was not still lying down in the snow next to Matty. He was instead standing up on his skis, skiing down a mountain, like on a mission. Matty's nowhere to be found. And on top of that, he didn't have his backpack and he didn't have his gun. Had no idea how long he'd been skiing for. He didn't know like where he was going. It was like he went from passed out to skiing, just magically skiing. Now, realistically, at this point, Aimo is thinking to himself, clearly what's happening here is I'm like hallucinating or something. Because how is it possible that I was just with Matty laying on the ground sleeping and now I'm here? Like, it didn't add up. And so as he's just sort of mindlessly skiing along, he's like telling himself, like, this is you dying. Like, this is you losing your mind before you die. Like, your mind is all over the place. Your body's still going for reasons he didn't really understand. Still at, full tilt, full energy. Didn't know why. But at some point that's going to give out and you're just going to die. Like, that's what's going to happen here. And so Aimo's only hope was that between now and when he died, that hopefully somebody would see him and save him. He knew it was an outside chance, but at this point, that's all he had. And so on he skied. No weapon, no backpack, no supplies. He's basically operating on no sleep, and he's just skiing. And for days and days, he doesn't stop. He can't believe his body is keeping up as well as it is. His mind is like totally gone, but he is just going for days and days and days. Doesn't run into anyone. But then one day, again, days later, he's skiing along, and magically almost, in front of him appears this building. He can't tell if it's necessarily a military outpost or civilian. He doesn't know if it's Finnish or German or Soviet. But he knows, even in his totally fractured mental state, that attempting to go in that building and hoping there are people in there that will save him, even if they won't, even if they kill him maybe, that is a better outcome, a better choice than doing what he's doing right now, which is the sort of endless ski to his death. And so Aimo starts skiing faster and faster towards this building, just like full reckless abandon, fully committed to this is my rescue or this is my death. And as he gets closer, he sees, sort of unbelievably, that this is a military installation, and it is a German military installation. And remember, the Finnish are allied with the Germans at this point, and so this is a safe place for him. And so he's so relieved, he can't believe he's gonna potentially survive this thing. He takes off his skis, and he starts running towards the front door of this building. But before he gets to the front door, he steps on something, and then there was a loud bang, and he's thrown into the air and comes crashing down. And when Aimo opened his eyes and sort of took stock of what had happened, he didn't feel any pain, but he looked down and he saw his foot was just a bloody mess. There was literally bones poking out of his ankle. Like he could see, clearly he sustained a horrible injury, and he must have just stepped on a landmine. But Aimo, determined to get into that building, he pulled himself up, again, sort of channeling this unbelievable just endurance he had been feeling the past several days that he'd been out here. He stood up and on one foot began hobbling his way towards this installation. And he finally gets to the front door of this German military base. And he grabs the doorknob and he's about to open it when there's another banging sound, and he's thrown again into the air. He had stepped on another landmine. And he comes smashing down, and he doesn't die. He doesn't feel any pain, but he looks down at his legs and he sees his other leg that was not injured a minute ago is now also mangled. So now he can't even stand. He's incapacitated. And on top of that, even though he's near this military outpost, he turns and looks at it, and now that he's a little bit closer and he's sort of looking more, intentionally at this building, he realizes it's abandoned. Like, this isn't going to save him. He's trapped. He's in the middle of nowhere, and there's no one here. And so at this point, Aimo just said, you know what? It's over. Like, I'm going to die. And so he literally just crawled his way over to this nearby ditch, let himself roll into it, and he just waited to die. He just knew it was over. But he didn't die. For days, he just laid in this ditch, like unable to die. He wanted to die. He wanted this to be over. Like, what else is he going to do? Who's going to save him? But he just watched the sun come up and set, go up, set, over and over and over. He lost track of how many days he was just laying there, again, bleeding profusely, like grievously injured. He hasn't eaten anything. He hasn't had any water. He can't believe he's still alive. He really can't believe it. And for days and days, Aimo just laid in this ditch, fully awake, fully alert, like just completely alive. It was like he wanted to die. He wanted his body to shut down and just have this end, but it's like his body wouldn't. It was still in this super intense, like hyper survival mode where his mind was a mess, but his body was just like full, stay alive, no matter what mode. And so he's just laying there, like wondering, when is this going to finally end? And it just wouldn't. Like days and days are going by. And then as he's laying there, one of these days, he's just in this ditch. He looks up during the daytime and he sees what looks like a plane flying overhead. Now, at this point, Aimo is in very bad shape. I mean, he's alive, but it's not going well. And he knows that, so he doesn't know if he's hallucinating this or what, but he felt like it was real. But after watching this plane circle overhead for a minute, Aimo was almost certain he heard the sound of this plane landing nearby. And then a couple of minutes later, he could have sworn from the ditch, he can't really see anything, he could hear the sound of people speaking in Finnish, his native language. And then a moment later, again, he didn't know if he was hallucinating or not, but he sees this head poke over the top of the ditch. And it was this young man, this young Finnish guy, and he's looking down at Aimo, and Aimo's looking back up at him. And then a second later, Aimo was being pulled out of the ditch. Later that day, IMO found himself laying in a hospital bed inside of a hospital in Finland. Like the man and the plane, all that, not a hallucination. He really had been rescued. And once he was at the hospital, it turned out he weighed just 94 pounds. He was also badly burned and frostbitten, and both of his legs were very badly mutilated and mangled. And his heart was beating at a staggering 200 beats per minute, despite the fact he's just laying in bed, not doing anything. And even more crazy was they couldn't actually get his heart to slow down. It just kept beating at this crazy high level. Now, at first, doctors and nurses and all the staff were like really shocked by IMO's condition. Not really just that he had survived, but again, like his heart rate. Like it just seemed like, dude, how are you alive right now? Like your heart can't beat at this level for this long without eventually killing you. But after they spoke to IMO and had him recount the whole ordeal of him being out, getting shot at and lost and the whole thing, they learned one really specific thing that explained the whole thing. When IMO and his, Finnish comrades were initially ambushed by the Soviet soldiers, they decided to flee. But IMO, he was having such a hard time physically keeping up with the other soldiers. Like he was just getting so tired from trying to break the tracks, and then he fell off, and he's thinking to himself, if I don't find a way to keep up, I'm gonna get captured or get killed by the Soviets. And so he's desperate. And so before he ultimately crashed down the side of the mountain from exhaustion, he tried something to try to give himself some energy, to try to make this escape. He pulled out these special military rations that he had been issued, along with everybody else in his squadron. They were all given these rations. And the reason you take these rations is to give yourself some energy. And so he takes these rations, and he's thinking, this is gonna do it. This is gonna give me the boost I need to get out of here and make the escape with my teammates. But the rations didn't work. And so he did sort of completely fall off. He was so tired to the point where he literally tumbled down the side of the mountain. His teammates, they skied off, and he smashes into a tree and he passes out. However, when IMO woke up, one, he was amazed he had not been captured or killed by the Soviets, but he's realizing he's all alone and like, what's going to happen to me? And then he starts to feel like, man, I just have a lot of energy. I can see and perceive things on a level that I couldn't before. Well, that's because the military rations had kicked in. And now he had like this abundance of energy. And it allowed him to basically ski indefinitely without sleeping, without having water, without food. He gets blown up twice. His feet have been blown off, basically. He's laying in a ditch dying, but he just can't seem to die. The guy should have died like several times, but these rations did their job. They gave him all the energy he needed to survive this crazy, crazy 2 weeks in the wild. Well, the military rations, they're called Pervitin. And this drug, I don't know if it's still given to soldiers now, but probably not, because effectively what Pervitin is just pure crystal meth. And so in essence, IMO survived in the wild for all this time because he was on just a pure meth-fueled rage. He was just completely high for 2 weeks, and it saved his life. One thing to note about Pervitin is it does have two distinct downsides. One, it is incredibly addictive, and two, it creates really, really intense hallucinations. And so very likely, he did not come across his own battalion who then opened fire on him. He did not come across Maddie, his teammate out in the wild who told him to lay down. And who knows, we're not even sure if the military installation he saw was real. Like, very likely all of that was just in his mind. However, the landmines, those were real. Somewhat unbelievably, IMO would make a full recovery, and he would go on to get married, he would have 9 children, and he would live to the age of 71. And as grateful as he was to the drug that did save his life, he never took Pervitin again.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today, we have two stories about individuals who go above and beyond to try to make sure investigators have everything they need to solve a case. However, in both instances, as you'll see, the cases take a wild, unexpected turn as a result of what these individuals provide that does solve the case, but in just an extremely unexpected way. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace all the water in the Follow Buttons ice tray with white vinegar. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called The Best is the Enemy of the Good. On the morning of October 20th, 1997, a 40-year-old man named Kevin Dowling rowed a small boat across a reservoir that was near his home in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania. And this reservoir was beautiful. It was quiet and peaceful out here, and the weather was perfectly cool, and the leaves on all the trees around the water were very colorful and starting to fall. And as Kevin looked around at all this incredible scenery, he knew he had chosen the exact right spot for what he needed to do. So Kevin had rented this boat to go fishing. But in reality, he was out here primarily just to have a place where he could relax and just think. So lately, Kevin's life had been incredibly stressful, and so moments of calm and peace were just very few and far between. The stress really began when, recently, Kevin had lost his full-time job. He had been an operations manager at a convenience store, and he had been fired after making just one mistake. And now he had to work the night shift at a Staples store just to support his family. And they were barely getting by. And Kevin, believe it or not, was generally speaking a very overachieving person. And so to have his life playing out the way it was, just very disappointing. And it was also just turning him into a very stressed out, angry person. And he knew that was happening. He'd been lashing out at his wife, yelling at his kids, and he had even gotten into this horrible altercation with an art gallery owner in town. And so finally, after a couple of months of just being this sort of awful person with these angry outbursts and sleepless nights as a result of all this stress, he knew he had to do something to turn things around. And so he thought this fishing trip was just what he needed. Kevin looked towards the front of the boat where there was a camera set up on a tripod. Anytime Kevin went out on these fishing expeditions, he would film himself, both to capture the moments he would catch the fish, and also because he just liked, after he'd returned from these trips, to just watch the footage all over again. It sort of brought him back to a time and place, out on the water that was just great. He liked fishing, it was peaceful, it was calm, and so he was doing that for this trip as well. Even though, right now, as he sat there, as serene as things were, he was filled with a whole lot of angst and a lot of stress and anxiety, but he figured, you know what, I'm out here, I need to put on a good performance for the camera, be the happiest version of myself I can be, so that when I return to dry land and I show this footage to my family and I refer to it myself, I don't want to see that I was so, upset while I was out here. This is supposed to be my catharsis. This is supposed to be a chance for me to decompress. So basically, he looked at the camera and sort of told himself, okay, smile and enjoy this trip. This is good for your mental health. And so Kevin rowed a bit further into the reservoir, and he came to a spot that he thought was good. He pulled in the oars, and then he reached over and turned on the camera and sort of waved and said, okay, I'm out here, about to start. And then he took a deep breath and he cast his line into the water. Early the next morning, Kevin was at his kitchen table feeling extremely tired. So the day before, after he had gone fishing on the reservoir, he had a night shift at Staples. And so he did the whole shift. He comes home, he barely sleeps, and now he's back up again. And so he's just totally exhausted, eating breakfast with his wife. And so while the two of them are just sitting there in silence, eating their food, there's this sudden sharp knocking on the front door. And the two of them look at each other like, who would this be? They both didn't know. And so Kevin got up, he walked to the front door, he opened it up, and he was very surprised to see two police officers standing there. And so Kevin asked them, how can I help you? And they told him they were here because of a fight that Kevin had gotten into with that art gallery owner a few months ago. They said that the entire situation had now escalated and the police needed to get a statement. Now, Kevin did not try to deny that he had gotten into a fight with this person. So instead, he just stepped outside to speak to them alone. And pretty much the instant he was out there speaking to the cops, it was like his stomach was just in knots. I mean, it just seemed crazy that the day before he was out on the beautiful reservoir, going fishing, having this sort of nice time. I mean, his life was so stressful these days, but it's like just yesterday, he had finally found some peace. He was so eager to watch back his video of him fishing. Like that was just a nice moment in time, a rare nice moment. And now he's got more problems, more stress being piled on. Like he couldn't believe it. But Kevin knew he needed to comply here. Like whatever they needed, he was going to try to give it to them. And so he just asked one of the officers to please explain a little bit more about what was really going on here. This seems pretty serious. And one of the officers, he just said, look, I can't give you too many details here. But they told him there had been another altercation at the art gallery yesterday morning. And Kevin was being considered a suspect at this point because he had previously gotten into a fight with this owner. Now, for Kevin, obviously, this was not good. This was very bad. This was shocking. This is not good news. But on the other hand, when they said this happened yesterday morning, I mean, Kevin's mind immediately went to his fishing trip. He had been fishing yesterday morning. He was at this reservoir that's at least 45 minutes away from the art gallery. He had receipts from taking that boat out. He had receipts from his fish bait. He even took a video that was likely time-stamped while he was out in the water. And so Kevin tells the officers that, I have no idea what happened at the art gallery, but I wasn't involved. Whatever happened yesterday, that was not me. A few seconds later, Kevin had led the officers into his house. He had gone upstairs, grabbed his fishing bag out of his closet. He had rifled through it and grabbed all the receipts and then come back downstairs. And when he did, he saw the officers were speaking to his wife and asking her about his alibi. And she had said, yes, Kevin had been fishing. And she'd even watched a home video of his trip that he had made because he always made videos of when he went fishing. And so at this point, the officers seemed satisfied and they took the receipts as well as the videotape that Kevin's wife had mentioned. And they said they'd just be in touch if they had any more questions. Over the next few days, Kevin totally forgot about the police stuff. I mean, whatever happened at the art gallery, that had nothing to do with him. That was totally separate. He had given the evidence over. He hadn't heard from the police. So in his mind, that's over and done with. However, on the evening of October 29th, so a little more than a week after the police had first shown up at his home, Kevin had just finished making dinner and was about to sit down and eat it with his family when the doorbell rang, followed by a series of very loud knocks. And so Kevin, he got up, sort of looked at his wife. They both exchanged a look who is this? And then he walked over to the front, and through the window, he could see who it was. It was the police again. But this time, when he opened the door, they didn't ask politely for him to just make a statement. Instead, one of them immediately stepped forward and slapped a pair of handcuffs on his wrists and said he was under arrest. So the real reason why Kevin's life had been so stressful, that really he couldn't get a night's sleep, that he's just constantly anxious, really didn't have to do with the fact that he had lost his job. That was part of it. But really it was the thing that caused his firing that was keeping him up at night. And that was actually his altercation with the art gallery owner a few months earlier. That altercation was actually really, really serious. It was not just he and this woman getting into a fight. No. Kevin robbed this woman and also assaulted her. And then he was subsequently arrested, lost his job because he was arrested, and then while he was out on bail, he's staring down this trial date that's looming for these charges he's been arrested for, and he knows there's footage of him, there's witness testimony, he's gonna lose. He's got no job, Like, he's going to look like a total pariah in the community. He's embarrassed. He's made this horrible decision. And like, his life is already basically wrecked. And it's only going to get worse if this goes to trial. And so what does he do? Kevin, the perfectionist who always sort of follows through on all the things in his life, to that point, he decides he needs to go back there to the art gallery and finish the job. He needs to get rid of this woman so there won't be a trial, so he won't be found guilty, so his life won't be ruined. And so, about a week ago, he did go back to the art gallery, he killed this woman, and then that same day, he goes out on the reservoir and pretends to be out there on this fishing trip. He films himself fishing because that's what he did always do, but really, it was just in order to create an alibi that would show he was out on the water, even though it was actually in the afternoon. He was not there in the morning. He filmed that video in the afternoon. He claimed it was in the morning. And basically, Kevin almost got away with it between the receipts for the boat and the bait and this video and his wife saying, oh yeah, he was fishing the day before. And Kevin was very innocent when he spoke to police. But what got him caught actually was the video. In the video, the position of the sun, which the officers picked up on, didn't make sense for it being the morning. It was too high in the sky. Like, if it had been the morning, it just would have looked visibly different. And so they determined that Kevin's video was not shot in the morning. He could have filmed that at any point later in the day, which created a window that morning that he could have gone back to the art gallery and he could have killed that woman, which he did. Also, just to add credibility to this theory that Kevin had forged this video, or at least forged the time he had shot it, an expert was able to determine that the timestamps on the video had been tampered with, further clarifying that this was a fake. Kevin was found guilty not only of the robbery and assault charges that he was initially charged with, but also he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, and as of April 2026, he is still on death row awaiting execution. Our second and final story today is called The Green Parrot. Just before 6 p.m. on Sunday, July 12, 1942, a man named Robert stumbled into a bar called the Green Parrot in Harlem, New York. And Robert was already very, very drunk. He'd been drinking all afternoon because he'd won a bunch of money in a dice game earlier that day, and he had just been celebrating. And now he was wandering into this bar, the Green Parrot, to keep the party going and keep on drinking. So at this point in 1942, the neighborhood where he was, Harlem, which is a neighborhood within New York City, it really struggled with a very high level of violent crime. And this bar, the Green Parrot, was very popular amongst locals. And so this bar attracted a big crowd, which often became a very rough crowd. And so because of how violent this area was, and because of all this cash that Robert had won earlier in the day, which he had on his person, Robert had decided to bring his gun with him out to the bar, like he was armed as he walked into the Green Parrot. And he was glad he was, because again, this is like a dangerous spot. But as Robert actually went inside of the Green Parrot, he found that it actually wasn't that crowded that night. Now, it was only about 6 p.m. and it would get much busier, or it usually got much busier later in the night. But at this point, even though he's very drunk, he looked around and he saw there was like maybe 20 people in there. And for Robert, this actually was kind of a good thing, because it meant it would be easier for him to get up to the bar and, get served, get more drinks. And so Robert staggered his way over to the bar where the owner, Max Geller, was pouring drinks and helping customers. And so Robert, he gets up there and he looks around, and right away he actually recognized a number of people that were there at the bar. They were regulars. And then he saw actually there was one particular regular, this shorter guy, who he knew was really mean and nasty and just super aggressive, and he clocked him as a guy that he wanted to keep his distance from. And so Robert turned his attention to Max, the owner, and he sort of sloppily waved at him, trying to get his attention. And Max, who was still busy preparing drinks for others, he sort of looked up and stared at Robert and kind of, did sort of like a check of him to see how drunk he really was. And then Max served the other people, and then he walked over to Robert with sort of a skeptical look on his face, and he's like, "What can I do for you, Robert?" And Robert, he's like closing one eye, he's so drunk, he's like, "Yeah, I want a drink." And Max looked at him and he's like, "No, you're too drunk, I can't serve you." Now, at first, Robert was just defensive and was basically like, "Come on, like I'm in here all the time, and I've certainly been pretty drunk before and you've served me. I don't understand why this is different." But Max stuck to his word and he's like, no, I'm not going to serve you. You're too intoxicated. And so slowly Robert became angrier and angrier, and he began saying, like, you're serving everybody else. There's guys here that are more drunk than me. Like, I don't get it. Like, you have to give me a drink. And at this point, Max, sensing just how upset Robert was, he said, look, now you're going to just have to leave. Like, I'm not going to serve you, and you have to leave. And Robert, he went from now just being mad to being humiliated. He's being like humiliated in front of the whole bar. And it was almost like he couldn't help what he did next. It was like rage coursed through his body. And almost without thinking, Robert drew his gun, aimed, and fired. And he shot Max in the face. Now, instantly, as soon as this shot rang out, the bar is just thrust into absolute chaos. People are screaming. Like 90% of the people in there had no idea this was even happening, let alone that people are shooting each other. It was just chaos. People are screaming, they're running around. And Robert, it was like he couldn't even believe what he had just done. And he just immediately pocketed and hid his weapon and sort of just backed away from the scene. Because again, people aren't even sure who got shot. People are looking around. He sort of began to blend into the crowd. And then as soon as he could, he just turned and ran out of the bar. About a half an hour later, around 6:30 p.m., an investigator with the New York City District Attorney's Office named Louis Panuco hurried down the sidewalk toward the Green Parrot, which at this point was swarming with police officers. Panuco, who had just been called to the scene, really only knew that there had been a shooting at this bar and that the victim had apparently been shot in the face but was alive, and he was on his way to the hospital. Outside the bar, Panuco could see a bunch of these police officers already interviewing a whole crowd of people, who Panuco assumed were witnesses of the shooting. And there were a lot of them. So Panuco hoped that at least one of them would have something useful to say. And so Panuco just let these officers handle this initial questioning of this group. If he needed to, he would speak to people later, but for now, he just headed inside the bar to see what was going on. And as soon as he stepped inside, another officer came up to Panuco to just give him a quick briefing. He said the bar's owner, Max Geller, was the one who had been shot, and he had been shot in the mouth, and that he was alive, but when he was taken off to the hospital, he was unconscious, so nobody could ask him what happened. Then this officer told Panuco that there had been a bunch of customers in the bar during the shooting, and that was the crowd outside. Those were the people that the officers were getting statements from. However, this officer told Panuco that so far, almost none of the people they were speaking with were cooperating. Pretty much everybody was just saying, oh, I don't know what happened, or I didn't see who shot who. It was like they didn't want to tell the police what they actually knew. The only witness so far who had said anything of substance was this very short, very loud regular, who even now, a half an hour after the shooting, was acting extremely agitated and just sort of like loud and very aggressive. It was the same regular that Robert, when he had first walked in, had noticed and thought, boy, I don't want to be around that person. This regular was just screaming that this whole thing was a robbery. That was like all he kept saying. It was a robbery. It was a robbery. But, I mean, in the eyes of the officers who were around this regular, this short, angry guy, it just sort of seemed like he was traumatized by what he saw. And so he was just repeating the word robber over and over and over again, in part likely because he was drunk, in part maybe because he was traumatized, and it was like a weird response he was having. So it was just sort of heavily discounted what he was saying. They're like, okay, maybe it was a robbery, but maybe you're just kind of out of it. But the officer told Panuco that, they searched the bar, at least they did a cursory search of the bar, and it didn't seem like anything had been taken. So it really didn't seem like this was a robbery. So again, it just seemed like this guy who was yelling about the robbery basically didn't know what he was talking about. And so at this point, Panuco, on the one hand, he was frustrated by what he was hearing, but also he really wasn't that surprised. I mean, he's thinking that, in this area in Harlem at this time, there was a huge distrust of police. I mean, most residents refused to cooperate with authorities. And so it was very likely that some of these people who were out here, not just the guy yelling about a robbery, but the other witnesses, it was very likely that at least one of them knew something. I mean, there wasn't that many of them in the bar at the time of the shooting, but it was just unclear if he would ever get any of that information. But Panuco knew he would obviously still have to try to get some information from these people. So after getting this brief from this officer, and after sort of walking around the inside of the bar for a second, Panuco headed back outside to try to talk to some of the witnesses himself. But pretty much immediately when he began speaking to these people, he saw that there definitely was like a front being put up. he just had this sinking feeling that this investigation was pretty much dead before it was even going to get started. Fast forward about a month, and Pinuco is still hard at work working on this case, except the case took a turn, because the victim, Max, he fell into a coma right after the shooting, and for weeks he had been in a coma, and authorities, Pinuco included, were hopeful he would wake up and he'd be able to give them additional information about what happened, give them anything, because no one by this point had given them any new information. They had basically no evidence, they had nothing. But unfortunately, Max, without regaining consciousness, just died. And so now this was not just a shooting investigation that Pinuco was in charge of. He was in charge of a homicide investigation. A homicide investigation with basically no leads. Because again, it's like none of the witnesses had given them anything. All they knew is Max got shot and now he's dead. And then the only other sort of substantive thing that had come out of any of their interviews was from that short, angry guy, the regular from the bar who had just demanded that this was a robbery. And, at first pass, they had looked around the bar. It didn't seem like anything had been taken, and they had sort of ruled out a robbery. But now, a month later, they had really looked into that angle, and they had confirmed that nothing had been taken from the bar. So this was definitely not a robbery. And so basically, Pinuco had nothing. And so at this point, Pinuco decided that his best bet here was actually just to basically start over, just to zoom back out and go back to square one and just see if there was something that they missed. And in fact, Pinuco had brought in a new detective, a guy named John Morrissey, to help him with this new approach. Morrissey was supposed to be this incredibly smart guy who was known for thinking outside the box, something that Pinuco felt like they could really use right now. And so on this particular day, Pinuco had sent Morrissey to the Green Parrot to just speak to anybody that was there. Just see if he could learn anything about the shooting from people that are at the bar where this happened, like right now. Just go there and talk to people. So off Morrissey goes, and Pinuco, he stayed at the station, and that day he was going to re-interview all of the patrons who had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, just to see if, maybe he could get some additional information out of them. And so far, that was not the case. Basically, all the interviews were dead ends like they had been the first time, and so he had somebody in the room with him right now, and the interview had gone nowhere, and he's like, you know what, you can go. Like, all right, on to the next one. And so that person leaves the interview room, and Pinuco, he gets up and he walks out into the hallway where all these patrons are sitting on chairs waiting to be interviewed. And as he's, getting ready to just grab the next person to speak to, he sees there are two women who were patrons in the bar who were sitting sort of halfway down the hallway, and they were talking to each other. And they were really not being careful about how loud they were speaking. Like, their conversation that they must have thought was private was loud enough that basically everybody in the hallway could hear it. But the reason it really stood out to Pinuco is they weren't speaking English. They were speaking French. Except unbeknownst to these women, who likely believed nobody in this hallway spoke French, Pinuco did speak French. And he could hear these women were talking about the case. They were saying that, hey, when you go in there to speak to this detective, tell him you don't know anything. Like, don't give him any information. Because if we do and we get wrapped up in this case, like, we're going to get dragged out into the public for being involved in this shooting. And what's going to happen is people are going to know that we were at that bar drinking on that night and we told our husbands we weren't. They're going to be so mad at us. Like, we gotta be quiet. Don't tell the detective anything. Just say you know nothing. And so immediately, Pinuco, he walks over to these two women and he points at one of them and says, hey, you're next. Come into the interview room. And he said this in English. And so the women were kind of surprised that they were being tapped to go next, or this woman was surprised. And so she gets up and sort of waves to her friend, and she follows Pinuco into the interview room. And so as soon as they sat down, Pinuco, in English, says to this woman, so are you really worried that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate with me? And the woman was clearly very surprised by this question, but she just sort of feigned like maybe she didn't fully understand because, she'd been speaking French out there. She doesn't know if Pinuco knows that she does or doesn't speak English. And so she just sat there in silence and just looked back at him like she didn't really understand. And Pinuco just stared back at her and then, in perfect French, asked the same question. Like, are you worried, again in French, that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate? And at this point, the woman knew, like, the jig was up. Clearly, this detective overheard the conversation they had in the hall. That's why he's pulled me in here. I'm caught red-handed. and the woman just began to break down and cry. And then after a few moments, without Pinuco even needing to push her to do this, she just started telling the whole story. She explained that her and her friend out in the hallway had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, and they actually did see who shot Max. She said it was this guy who was wearing a black and white checkered suit. He had gone up to the bar, and then some sort of altercation happened, and he pulled out a gun, and he shot Max, and then he quickly ran out of the bar. Now, she told Pinuco that she didn't know this guy's name, but she definitely recognized him. She said that, she had been to the Green Parrot before the night of the shooting, and she had seen this guy, and she thinks that he's just like a regular at this bar. Like, she would definitely recognize him again if she saw him. And so Pinuco at this point, he could barely contain his excitement. This was really like the first meaningful lead in the whole case. You have a suspect who apparently is a regular at the bar where the shooting took place, and he dresses in a really distinct way. He wears, flashy clothing. Like, this is a great lead. And so Pinuco, he's thrilled. He thanks this woman. He goes out and he grabs the other woman and he brings her in for questioning. And she would echo the same story as the first woman, that yes, they had been there. They had seen this guy. He was a regular, they thought, and he wore these flashy clothes. And so after this, Pinuco is like, I got to tell Detective Morrissey. I got to fill him in on what I've just learned. This totally changes the case. And so he ran over to Morrissey's office to see if he was back yet from the Green Parrot, but when he went in there, he saw that he wasn't. And so Pinuco, he's like, all right, I'll go back to my office and I'll start making a plan for what we're going to do next until Morrissey gets back, and then I'll brief him up then. And so Pinuco, he goes to his office, he starts excitedly making, plans of what they're going to do, and then a moment later, his door bursts open and Morrissey comes flying into the room. And he looks totally out of breath, like he's rushed to be here to tell Pinuco something. But Pinuco, he turns, and even though he sees, clearly Morrissey's got something to tell me, he doesn't let Morrissey talk because Pinuco, he's got this big news about the French women. And he just starts telling Morrissey all about this crazy revelation and how he caught them speaking French and they were there. And we have this suspect now. He tells him everything he knows. And so Morrissey, even though he had something big to say himself, he's sitting there listening to Pinuco go on. And at the end of it, he's like, man, that is amazing. That's awesome. Great lead. But I'll do you one better. I know the killer's name. It would turn out when police first arrived at the Green Parrot after the shooting, on day one of this investigation, what they found was basically nothing. They have a victim, and they have a bunch of witnesses, but none of the witnesses would cooperate. There was no leads, no information, no real evidence. All they had was basically this one short, loud, angry guy who kept talking about a robbery. But they had sort of looked around the bar and it didn't appear like this was a robbery, and so he had been discounted. And everyone's like, well, he's traumatized. He's sort of like this angry guy who's sort of a mess. We're not going to take him seriously. What he's saying doesn't really add up, so he was kind of discounted. But it would turn out they actually just misunderstood this guy. He wasn't saying robbery, but they didn't know that at the time. They thought he was. They ruled him out. Fast forward a month, and Mr. Think Outside the Box detective, Morrissey, he goes back to the Green Parrot to see what he can learn. And so Morrissey, he's hearing this, and he was told this is what this short guy was saying the first time too. This is not that surprising. But Morrissey, he thought outside the box, and he figured out what this witness actually meant. The key to doing this was really understanding exactly who this witness was and what the witness was actually capable of knowing. Because this witness, this short, angry guy, was actually a literal green parrot that the bar was named after. The parrot was the owner, Max's, pet, and he was always there in the bar. He was a regular, sitting on his perch. And the bird was a huge tourist draw because he was kind of really aggressive and could be sort of mean, and people thought it was pretty funny. And critically, this parrot had been trained to recognize the bar's regulars and refer to them by name. So when Morrissey went back to the bar and listened to the parrot again, he eventually realized the bird was not saying robber, robbery, and trying to describe what had happened. No, instead, the bird was saying Robert, the name of the person responsible, the regular who he had seen commit this crime. And wouldn't you know it, between this new information and what Pinuco had learned from the two French women at the police station, they put their information together, and they discovered that there really had been a regular at the Green Parrot Bar, a guy named Robert Butler, who was a 28-year-old cab driver who had fled to Baltimore right after the shooting. The detectives were able to track Robert down and confront him about the murder, and when they explained how they'd figured it all out, Robert just had one thing to say: "I never did like that bird." Robert Butler was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Green Parrot Bar eventually closed, and as for the actual Green Parrot, nobody knows what happened to him. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and Kate Gallagher. Story editing by Evan Allen and by Luke Baratz. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. On an early morning in December of 1991, a woman living in Largo, Florida, woke up to the sound of pounding on her front door. And as she climbed out of her bed, she realized it was not just pounding on her door she was hearing. Also, whoever was out there was screaming for help. When the woman realized there was some sort of crisis here, she kind of rushed and ran to the front door. She opened it up, and standing out on the front porch was her neighbor. And she was practically covered head to toe in blood. Her head was covered in gashes. Her throat clearly had been slit. But before this woman could say what was even going on, she just fell to the ground and passed out. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is taking a well-deserved nap, make sure you immediately go over and wake them up with a leaf blower. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of December 14th, 1991, a 31-year-old man named Keith Young grabbed his car keys from a hook by the front door of his home in Largo, Florida. Behind him, his wife, Anita, slipped on her favorite pair of heels. The newlywed couple was about to head out on a much-needed date night. They were both actually on their second marriages, and they had 6 children between them from their previous relationships. So naturally, it was pretty hard to find time for just themselves. But that particular night, Keith's 2 kids were staying with their mother, who had shared custody, and Anita's 8-year-old daughter was at a sleepover, and her 12-year-old son Jason had agreed to stay home and watch his 2 younger siblings so that the adults could go out for dinner. Before they left, Keith gave Jason a final rundown of his expectations. Don't make too much of a mess, make sure nobody gets hurt, and if there was an emergency, he'd written down the restaurant's phone number on a notepad in the kitchen. But Keith reminded Jason that if there were like a real emergency, like a true crisis, he should call 911 right away. And when he heard this, Jason, the 12-year-old, just kind of rolled his eyes and said, "Yeah, I got it. It's under control." Now, Keith knew he was actually being a little bit uptight here, but there'd been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and he'd been on edge about leaving the kids home alone ever since. The intruder had actually cut their phone lines and then also taken off a window screen, and they'd also tried to break down a door as well. But they'd actually left without taking anything, and there hadn't been any more issues in the months since. But critically, the suspect was never caught, so it felt kind of unresolved and scary for the family. Keith and Anita both hugged Jason goodbye as they walked out the door. And then once the door closed behind them, Keith turned around and checked the handle to double check that he'd locked it, just to be safe. Less than a half hour later, Keith and Anita sat down across from each other at the restaurant and unfolded their napkins onto their laps. They were excited to have a few hours of peace and quiet, where they could just, focus on each other, something that didn't happen very often. The couple had gotten married earlier that year after meeting at a support group for single parents, and they were very grateful to have each other because their previous marriages were really not that great. Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass, had a violent temper, and even though he now lived all the way across the country in Idaho, he still found a way to always complicate Anita's life. That summer, Luther had driven all the way to Keith and Anita's house to take his kids on a vacation, which Anita had initially agreed to, but when he showed up, he was unexpectedly driving a camper with his new girlfriend and her kids. And at that point, Anita had gotten a really bad feeling about the whole situation, and she actually started to worry that Luther would take her kids and then refuse to give them back. And so they had this big argument, and it got so bad that actually Anita had threatened to call the police before Luther finally backed off and left. Meanwhile, Keith had been having equally heated arguments with his ex-spouse, Linda, about whether their kids would spend the upcoming holidays with him or with Linda and her new husband, Steve. Things had gotten so nasty that Linda had actually recently begun harassing Anita over the phone and was also gearing up to go to court and try to get the custody agreement changed if Keith wouldn't agree to do things her way. But their bad relationships with their exes only made Keith more happy that he'd found Anita. He was glad that he could take care of her and her kids the way he felt like they deserved. So despite all the tension hanging over them, he tried to keep the mood light, and they enjoyed a very nice dinner. And then when the check came, Keith glanced at his watch and realized it was getting pretty late. He knew Anita's son Jason was a responsible kid and that he could definitely handle getting his younger siblings into bed, but Keith was still a bit worried about leaving the kids alone for too long. So he paid the check right away, and then he and Anita left the restaurant and drove home. A little while later, Keith and Anita pulled up outside of their brown single-story home. When they got inside, Keith was relieved to see that all the kids were calmly watching TV in the living room and the family cat was curled up on the couch right next to them. Keith told them that it was time to get ready for bed. And as 12-year-old Jason got up, Keith pulled him in for a big hug and told him he was proud of him for his hard work babysitting. Anita helped the younger kids brush their teeth, and then afterwards, Keith turned off the lights and he went down the hall and said goodnight to all three kids, who slept in bunk beds in the same room. Then, after that, he continued down the hallway to the main bedroom and climbed into bed with Anita. He kissed his wife goodnight and then turned off the light. Several hours later, around 3 a.m. early the next morning, Anita's 12-year-old son Jason awoke to a very loud noise, and when he heard it, he sat up in bed. And then he could hear something thumping around in the room next to him. But before he could figure out what was going on, someone screamed. With his vision still blurry from sleep, Jason slid off the top bunk and walked over to the door and cracked it open. And in the dark hallway, he could quickly make out the shadowy shapes of what appeared to be two men moving around, sort of struggling with each other, fighting. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that one of these men was his stepdad, Keith, but he couldn't make out anything about the other man, except that he was really big and wearing what appeared to be a black ski mask. Jason immediately felt paralyzed by fear, because he knew, this was obviously another intruder, just like the one who tried to break into their house that summer. For a second, he was hopeful that maybe his stepdad would fend the man off, but then Jason noticed there was blood sprayed all over the walls, and then he saw the glint of a knife in the intruder's hand. The intruder had Keith pinned to the ground and was stabbing him over and over again. At the same moment, Jason saw his mother, Anita, run out of the master bedroom, also covered in blood, and she was holding a baseball bat. And she swung it at the intruder, and she hit him in the back of the head, but it barely slowed him down. And that's when Jason heard his stepdad yell out for Anita to get the gun. And Anita, she ran into another room, and Jason just stood there looking out the crack, just paralyzed with shock, watching as this intruder literally picked Keith up and threw him back into the master bedroom. And the next thing Jason knew, he saw his mother standing in the hallway holding a gun, and the intruder was running away out the front door. Suddenly, Jason kind of snapped out of the shocked trance he had found himself in and remembered what Keith had told him to do in case of a real emergency. Call 911. So he ran to the phone in the kitchen, he picked it up, and he dialed. But when he put the receiver to his ear, all he heard was silence. There was no dial tone. Jason looked over and he saw his mother kind of hobbling over towards him. She was standing in the doorway, and there was blood visibly dripping down her neck. Jason's voice cracked when he told his mother that the phone line was dead. Anita told her son to go back with his stepdad and just wait, that she was going to go find help. And so Jason began to walk towards the bedroom where he knew his stepdad was, and as he did, he watched his mom run out the front door into the night. And then Jason, he went down the hallway and went into the bedroom where he saw his stepdad sprawled out on the bed. And he was still alive, but he was clearly struggling to breathe. He's kind of gasping and, gurgling. And Jason, this 12-year-old kid, not having any idea how to handle this, just walked over to the bed, kneeled down, and he took Keith's hand and just held it while he waited for his mom. And as he held Keith's hand, he could hear the sound of his stepfather take his last few raspy breaths before he went completely limp. Several hours later, before dawn on the morning of December 15th, 1991, Detective Mike Short from the Largo Police Department pulled up to the curb outside of a brown single-story house surrounded by crime scene tape. He'd gotten a call from his supervisor, who really didn't know much, just that an intruder had broken into this house and attacked a husband and wife while they slept. But now, as Short got out of his car and looked around at the quiet block of modest, well-kept houses, he found that kind of odd. This really wasn't a neighborhood where they saw violent home invasions. As Short walked up to the house, a uniformed officer caught up with him and gave him a few more details about what they knew so far. He said that the wife, Anita Young, had run to a neighbor's house screaming for help before passing out from blood loss in their front yard, and the husband, Keith Young, was deceased in the bedroom. The officer also said that the couple's 12-year-old son had woken up at some point and witnessed the attack. And for now, he was over at the neighbor's house until they could track down another guardian. The officer said that Anita had been taken to a hospital, but it would be a miracle if she survived. Her injuries were some of the worst they'd ever seen. As Short went up the walkway that led to the front door, he saw that blood had dripped all over the cement. The front door was open, and right inside he saw a baseball bat lying on the floor with blood on the handle. Short stepped inside, and he saw more blood. Blood that was spattered and smeared basically all over the living room, on the walls, the doors, the furniture, as if the suspect and the victims had been fighting all throughout the house. In fact, it was so chaotic and messy that Short thought maybe the suspect was not expecting to fight off two grown adults. Otherwise, they might have come up with a better plan of attack. So Short's first assumption was that this likely was a robbery that had gone terribly wrong. As he continued down the hallway, a cat ran past him. It was unharmed, and it went to hide under the couch. The hallway was somewhat unbelievably even bloodier than the living room, with red smears all over the walls and floors, so Short figured most of the attack must have occurred here. Short reached the main bedroom and looked inside, and he saw Keith's body lying on the bed, covered head to toe in blood. Keith's shirt was shredded, and Short could see there were multiple stab wounds to his chest and also a very deep gash down his side. Short decided not to actually go into the bedroom until crime scene techs had gone through it for forensic evidence. So instead, he just walked down the rest of the hallway and pushed open the door to another bedroom, where he was surprised to see two small children soundly asleep in their bunk beds. Somehow, these kids had slept through the entire attack. Short went back outside and immediately flagged down a uniformed officer, and he told him to go in there and wake up those kids and bring them somewhere safe. Then once the officer went inside, Short pulled out his flashlight and began searching the yard for evidence. Based on Keith's wounds, at least what he saw, Short thought he was probably attacked with a knife, or maybe even an axe or a machete. But apart from that bloody baseball bat that was found in the doorway, there was no sign of a weapon anywhere inside or outside of the house. But as Short went around the side of the house, he found something else that was interesting. The home's phone lines had clearly been cut. The killer must have planned ahead to make sure nobody in this house could call out for help. And this was interesting because nothing else about the scene suggested that this crime was carefully planned. In fact, in some ways you could say it looked like it was very unplanned. But now, Short had to consider that maybe this was not just a random robbery gone wrong. Maybe, especially given the cut phone lines, this was like a premeditated attack, a premeditated murder. And if that was the case, he had to figure out who the intended target was. Keith, or Anita, or both. A little while later, Detective Short walked up the street to the neighbor's house to speak with his best eyewitness, Anita's 12-year-old son, Jason. After Short knocked on the door, the neighbors let him inside and showed him into their living room, where he saw Jason was wrapped in a blanket and still wearing his pajamas. Short sat down across from him and told him that he knew it must be extremely difficult to talk about this, but he really needed to know exactly what he had seen and what he had heard during this attack. Tears began to roll down Jason's face as he began to describe watching his mother and stepfather fight off this intruder. Jason said he couldn't really describe what this person looked like because they were wearing a ski mask, but he was pretty sure it was a man. He also said there had been a little bit of skin exposed on the killer's neck, and from the looks of it, it appeared like their skin was maybe fairly dark, so Short wrote down that the suspect likely had dark skin. But because it was dark, and Jason clearly had not gotten a very good look at the killer, he knew the boy could be wrong too. So he was just putting it down as a maybe. Short asked Jason if the intruder had said anything during the attack, and Jason just shook his head and said no. He said the intruder didn't say a single word the entire time. And Short made note of that too, because it made him wonder if maybe the killer was someone close to the family, and they knew that if they spoke, someone might recognize their voice, like Jason. Later that same morning, once the sun had come up, Short went back to Keith and Anita's house and searched the outside of the property again, in case he missed anything when it was dark. And while he was searching the front yard, another police cruiser pulled up to the curb. An officer got out and walked over to Short. She asked if he was the lead investigator on this case, and when he said he was, the officer told him that she'd been waiting at the hospital all morning, and Anita had finally woken up enough to say a few words. She said Anita was only awake for just a few minutes before she had to be rushed back into surgery, but it was long enough to answer a couple of questions. Anita had described waking up to see a man standing over her with an axe in one hand and a knife in the other. She said it was a man that she had never seen before. She didn't recognize anything about him. The officer said right before Anita was taken off to surgery, there was one more thing she mentioned. There had been an attempted break-in at their house earlier that year, and the intruder, during that break-in, had also cut their phone lines. Short instinctively turned and literally looked at the side of the house where those lines had been cut, and he thought to himself, this is too strange of a coincidence to be ignored. Later that day, back at the station, Short read through reports on the interviews his team had done with Keith and Anita's kids and their neighbors. A team of 5 detectives had been assigned to this case, and they'd made quick progress on collecting background information on the victims. Everybody in the neighborhood had described the victims as being a very normal, happy couple. Keith was an air conditioning technician who'd been working at the same company for a very long time, and Anita was mostly a stay-at-home mom who did some accounting work on the side. However, what also came out in these interviews was that both Keith and Anita had ex-spouses who could potentially want to hurt them. Anita's ex-husband, Luther, lived thousands of miles away in Boise, Idaho, but Short knew that despite the distance, it was not impossible that he might have traveled to Florida to commit this crime. So Short called the Boise police and told them about this attack, and asked them to track down Luther and question him. As for Keith's ex-wife, Linda, Short had learned that she actually lived right there in town, and Keith's 2 kids were still at her house, unaware that their father was dead. And since Linda and her new husband Steve were potential suspects, Short wanted to be the one to break the news to them, to see how they all reacted. So he looked up Linda's address in the database, and then grabbed his keys and headed out. Less than an hour later, Short parked his car in Linda's driveway and walked up to the front door. He knocked, and a woman opened the door, and Short asked her if she was Linda, and she said yes. And then he flashed his badge and said he'd like to come in. And Linda, she seemed a bit confused, but she opened the door and let him inside. Short walked into what seemed like a perfectly normal Sunday morning routine inside of the house. The air smelled like eggs and bacon, and the 2 kids were in the living room watching cartoons with a man who Short figured must be Linda's new husband, Steve. And so Short, he asked Steve to leave the kids and come into the kitchen with he and Linda, because he wanted to speak to both of them. And then once all 3 of them had sat down at the kitchen table, Short broke the news that Keith had been murdered. And then Short watched as Linda literally collapsed into Steve's arms. Short gave them a minute, but then he cut right to the chase, and he asked where Linda and Steve had been at about 3 a.m. that morning. Linda seemed shocked to realize that clearly the detective was considering both her and her husband as suspects, but she choked out that they'd both been at home with the kids sleeping. And Steve just nodded in agreement. He said they'd all been home together all night, that was it. Nothing about their demeanor or their reactions was suspicious to Short. But when he pressed Linda about what her relationship with her ex-husband was like, she admitted that it was contentious, and that actually just a couple of days earlier, she'd spoken to a lawyer about potentially changing their custody agreement. Short found the timing of this a little convenient, and he wondered, maybe Linda or Steve had decided they would just settle the custody battle by simply taking Keith out of the picture for good. And he also found it convenient that Linda and Keith's 2 kids weren't at Keith's house when the attack happened. It was only Anita's kids who were there at the time. But Short thanked the couple for their time and told them he would be in touch if he had any more questions. And then he left their house, and as he got into his car and drove back to the station, he kept going over the conversation he had just had in his mind. Linda and Steve's alibis were pretty weak. They seemed to be the only 2 people who could vouch for their whereabouts for the night of the murder, and so what that meant was Short had every reason to keep both of them at the very top of his suspect list. Late that night, Short was sitting at his desk in his office when his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the police in Boise, Idaho. They'd managed to track down Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Short immediately sat up straight and grabbed a pencil to take notes. The officer on the line told him that when they'd gotten to Luther's house, he wasn't there. But his fiancée, Connie, was. And she told them that he'd been out on a weekend hunting trip. So the officers had gone out and searched for Luther in the area where he said he'd been hunting, but they didn't find him until that evening when Luther actually arrived back at his house. The officer said, at that point they took him in for questioning, and he had told them the same thing that Connie had, that he'd been out elk hunting about an hour away from Boise all weekend. Luther had been able to describe basically every step of his hunting trip in great detail, but since he had been hunting alone, there was nobody to corroborate his alibi. Now, Short knew that the drive from Boise to Largo, Florida, where the attack took place, took at least 3 or 4 days. So the fact that Luther was in Boise less than 24 hours after the murders meant that he could not have driven there. But there was still a possibility that if he was involved, maybe he could have flown. Now, Short knew it would be difficult, but not impossible, for Luther to catch a plane to Florida and back during the time that he was supposedly out hunting. So he told the Boise officer to look into whether Luther had recently purchased an airline ticket and to also take saliva, blood, and hair samples from Luther. After Short hung up the phone, he just sat back in his chair and thought for a second. It was less than 24 hours into this investigation, and Short already had 3 suspects in his crosshairs: Keith's ex-wife Linda, and Linda's new husband Steve, and also Anita's ex-husband Luther. And then also, to some degree, Luther's fiancée, Connie, could have been involved, but based on logistics and the fact that she was at the house, it seemed unlikely. But there was one big problem. Based on Anita and Jason's eyewitness testimony, the suspect they were looking for was a dark-skinned man who Anita had never met before, and that description would not apply to any of their suspects. Short knew that the suspect description might not be reliable. After all, it had been dark in the house, so Jason could have been wrong about the killer's skin color, and Anita was barely conscious during her interview, so her recollections might not be accurate at all. But if it was accurate, it could mean any number of things for Short's investigation. It could mean it was a random robbery after all, just some random person who went in the house and did this horrible thing. It could also mean that, one of his current suspects had maybe hired somebody to commit the crime, or it could mean that all Short's theories about the case were just completely wrong, and he had no idea what happened. Short rubbed his eyes and looked at the clock and realized it was almost midnight, so he decided it was time to go home and get some sleep. Maybe, he hoped, by morning, a new piece of evidence might turn up that would help point him in the right direction. Around 7 a.m. the next morning, so about 28 hours after Keith's murder, Short pulled into the parking lot of Pinecrest Golf Course, which was less than a mile away from Keith and Anita's house. And at this very moment, Short was feeling really optimistic about the case, because a groundskeeper at this golf course had called the police that morning and said they'd found a ski mask and a glove lying in the grass. So now, Short got out of his car and he went into the clubhouse, and the groundskeeper was there waiting for him. And he said he had left the ski mask and the glove right outside, right where he had found them. So Short followed the groundskeeper out onto the course, and as they walked, Short made note of all the ponds scattered around, and also the lake at the park right across the street. He wondered if maybe the killer might have tossed their weapon or weapons into the water. A minute later, the groundskeeper stopped walking and pointed down at the ground, at a black ski mask and a dark-colored cotton glove lying in the grass, exactly as promised. And so Short put on a pair of latex gloves and he knelt down and he carefully lifted up the mask. And as he did, he felt that clearly it was crusted with something reddish brown, very likely dried blood. As soon as Short got back to the station, he sent the mask and the glove off to the crime lab for testing, hoping that they might find a trace of the killer's DNA. Then Short spoke to his supervisor about sending a team of divers out to search the water at the golf course and also that park, in case the murder weapons had been disposed of in any of those water bodies. It seemed like a long shot that they would actually find something, but it was the best lead they had so far, and finding the weapon or weapons could really help them narrow down their suspect list. And by the time Short got back to his desk, he saw that his answering machine was blinking. There was a new message. And so he hit play, and the message was from a man who said he had information on the Keith Young case. So Short called him back right away. And when the man answered, he said he was a college student who lived a block away from Keith and Anita Young's house. And he said on the night of the murder, he and his friends had been hanging out in his driveway, and they'd seen a man jogging east down Coronet Avenue. And Short immediately turned and looked at the map on the wall, and he got really excited because he saw Coronet Avenue was actually the exact path the killer would have had to take to get from Keith and Anita's house to that golf course. Short asked the young man to describe this jogger, and the college student said that it appeared to be a white man with short dark hair. Short asked him if he was pretty sure about that, and the student said yeah. In fact, the jogger had passed under a streetlight at one point, so they all got a pretty good look. This was a huge development, since 12-year-old Jason, one of the eyewitnesses, had said the killer had dark skin. It was very possible now that maybe Jason was wrong. But it was also possible that there were now two men involved in the attack. Maybe one had dark skin and one had light skin. The following week, Short opened up a folder that had just been sent over from the police in Northport, Florida, a town 85 miles away. On December 19th, so just 4 days after Keith Young was murdered, a man and 3 kids in Northport, Florida were shot to death in the middle of the night inside of their home. The suspects in that attack were 2 men wearing ski masks, and they had cut the house's phone lines. So the similarities between these 2 killings were easy to see, but as far as Short could tell, the victims in the second attack didn't have any connections to the Youngs. Plus, the victims in the second attack had been shot instead of stabbed. And so as Short really did try to look for all the similarities he could between the 2 crime scenes, he just couldn't get over how sort of blatantly personal the very violent and bloody attack felt at the Youngs' house. So even though there was this other, on the surface, similar killing in Florida, and even though Jason and Anita both swore they did not recognize the intruder, Short was not ready to rule out that Keith Young had been killed by someone who knew him. His strongest suspect was still Anita's ex-husband, Luther, who claimed to have been out hunting alone at the time of the attack. As for Anita, her condition had actually finally stabilized, and when Short had gone to speak to her at the hospital, she had said that Luther was really the only person she could think of who might want to hurt her, because they'd been arguing a lot about custody and also child support. But the Boise police had checked with every airline in the country, and none of them had a record of Luther flying into Florida that weekend. So Short couldn't even prove that Luther was in the state at the time of the attack. And then also, Anita had mentioned that she'd been having problems with Keith's ex-wife, Linda. She said that Linda had been harassing her all summer long, calling her so many times that she couldn't even use her own phone. Short definitely still had his eye on Linda, but he still hadn't found anything directly linking Linda or her new husband Steve to the crime. But Short was still very hopeful that this case would get solved, because a preliminary report from the forensics lab had just come in that said a Caucasian hair had been discovered inside the black ski mask that was found on the golf course, which could point to any one of Short's main suspects. And Short knew it was only a matter of time before the forensics lab finished its full analysis of that hair sample, and then they would know for sure if it was an exact match. One day in early January of 1992, so a few weeks after Keith's murder, Detective Short got into the office and checked his answering machine, and he found that he'd gotten a message from the forensics lab telling him to call back right away. And so right away he picked up the phone and dialed the number, and he could feel his heart pounding as the line rang. This could finally be the break in the case he'd been waiting for. And when the technician picked up, he told Short that, they had analyzed that hair in the mask, and they'd analyzed the DNA. But it was not a match for Short's top suspect, Anita's ex-husband, Luther. Not a match. Short thanked the technician and hung up, feeling very disappointed. Now, this still didn't fully rule Luther out, especially because Short still thought there might have been maybe 2 suspects involved. But he decided that at this point, it was time for investigators to really focus on other possibilities. Several weeks later, so in early 1992, roughly a couple of months after Keith Young's murder, Detective Short knocked on the front door of Linda's house. Linda is Keith's ex-wife. And when Linda opened the door and saw the detective once again standing outside her house, she quickly let him inside. The house was quiet, and Linda told Short that she was the only one home. They sat down in the living room, and then they ran through all the subjects that Short had grilled her on the first time around. Her alibi, her custody disputes, her tense relationship with Keith, and none of her answers changed. And she really didn't say anything that could be viewed as incriminating. But as their conversation began to wrap up, Linda looked anxious, like there was something more she wanted to say. Short asked her what was going on, and she said that there was something she hadn't mentioned when they had spoken the first time. It was about her new husband, Steve. She said that a while back, after she and Steve had gotten married, that briefly she had rekindled her relationship with Keith. Steve had found out that she was cheating on him, and he was naturally very upset. Linda said that a few months ago, Steve had even made a few jokes about hurting Keith. At the time, she didn't think he was serious, but after Keith was killed, she started worrying that Steve might have somehow been involved. She said that she had even gone so far as to check Steve's knife collection to make sure none of them were missing. Short was careful not to let his shock come across his face, but inside, his mind was absolutely spinning. He'd always thought it was possible that Linda and Steve were both in on the murder, but now it sounded like maybe Steve might have acted alone. He also wondered, though, if Linda was ratting out her husband to draw suspicion away from herself. So, to help get to the bottom of it, he asked Linda to come with him back to the station for a polygraph test. He also planned to order another polygraph for Steve, who was suddenly at the very top of his suspect list. But almost 2 months later, in March of 1992, Short was back in his office, staring down at a pile of documents he'd already read over 1,000,000 times, and the evidence still didn't point him toward anybody in particular. Linda and Steve had both taken their polygraph tests, but the results did not indicate they were guilty, and there was still no hard evidence that tied either of them to the crime. Also, after searching all the ponds and that lake in the area, police still had not found a murder weapon. And they'd still not been able to match that strand of hair from the presumed killer's ski mask to any of the suspects on their radar. Short still had really 3 main suspects who could have been responsible for the murder. There was Keith's ex-wife Linda, who had been fighting with him about custody. Her alibi was weak and only supported by her new husband Steve, who she had been suspicious of when Short interviewed her for a second time. And so Steve was also one of his primary suspects because he had this, terrible history with Keith and had even openly joked about, hurting Keith. And then there was Luther, Anita's hot-headed ex-husband who lived on the other side of the country. Now, it would have been possible for him to fly from Idaho to Florida and commit this crime, but there was no proof that he did. And of course, there was still the possibility that this was just a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. And investigators still couldn't even be sure if they were looking for 1 or 2 or more suspects. They had no idea. So Short had plenty of theories, but still no evidence to back any of them up. The investigation had gone so cold that the task force assigned to the case had been reduced from 5 detectives to just 2. Short was starting to fear that Keith's murder might never be solved. But just then, Short's phone rang. And when he picked up the receiver, a voice said that they knew something about that previous break-in attempt at Keith and Anita's house a few months before Keith's murder. And as Detective Short listened to what this caller had to say, he suddenly knew exactly who had broken into that house and killed Keith and tried to kill Anita. Based on all the collected evidence, as well as the killer's eventual partial confession, this is what investigators believe happened to Keith and Anita Young on the morning of December 15th, 1991. At 3 a.m., the killer saw that all the windows in Keith and Anita's house were dark. So they carefully snuck around the side of the home and cut the phone lines, just like they'd done a few months before. The first time, they'd second-guessed themselves and didn't go through with what they had planned. But this time was going to be different. The killer broke into the house very easily, feeling very calm and in control. They had an axe in their right hand and a knife in their left. As they made their way through the living room, they heard growling and hissing, and they looked down to see the family's cat standing in their path. They thought about strangling the cat to shut it up, but decided not to. They wanted to do this with as little collateral damage as possible. So they bent down and tried to soothe the cat, and when it worked and the cat became quiet, the killer stepped past the cat and began walking down the hall. They made it to the master bedroom, they opened up the door and stepped inside. Anita and Keith were fast asleep in their beds, and so the killer quietly walked over to the side of the bed that Anita was on, and they stood there looking down at her, getting ready to do what they felt like they had to do. But as the killer was looking down at Anita, Anita stirred awake, and for a brief second, she looked up and locked eyes with the killer. And the killer instinctively just swung the axe down, hitting Anita squarely in the head. But she fought back and she shouted out Keith's name to wake him up. And the next thing the killer knew, Keith was on top of them, pulling them away from Anita. And so the killer began hitting Keith with the axe as well, but even despite being hit about 3 times, Keith would not let up. And so they struggled and shoved each other, and their fight kind of spilled out of the bedroom into the main portion of the house. This was not how the killer had hoped this would go. They'd wanted to get this done quickly and leave without anybody waking up, but they'd clearly underestimated Keith. No matter how many times the killer stabbed him or hacked at him with the axe, he didn't stop fighting. And then as the killer and Keith continued sort of fumbling around and making their way back down the hallway, the killer suddenly felt something hard smash into the back of their skull, and they turned to see Anita standing there behind them with blood running down her face and a baseball bat in her hands. The killer heard Keith shout out for Anita to go get the gun, and he saw Anita run toward a nearby closet. The killer also noticed a young boy looking out from a doorway nearby, and so the killer made a split-second decision. They just grabbed Keith and chucked him into the master bedroom, and then the killer sprinted back down the hallway and out the front door. And then when they got to the sidewalk, they removed their ski mask and kind of casually jogged down the street, hoping that to anybody looking outside, they would think the killer was just, an unassuming health nut out for a very early morning run. When they got to a nearby golf course, they stopped on the grass to change their clothes. And then after that, they stole a bike and rode away. Things had not gone the way the killer had hoped. But as they reflected on what they had just done, they thought to themselves that in reality, this actually could have gone worse. They didn't kill the cat, and critically, no kids have been hurt either. And in some ways, that's what this was all about, to avoid hurting the kids. Because the killer was Anita's ex-husband, Luther Bass. He'd wanted to get Anita out of the way so he could have custody of their 4 kids and treat them the way he believed they needed to be treated. And he'd wanted to get Anita out of the way so that he could have custody of his 4 kids. He felt like she was screwing up their lives, that he was the kids' solution. They needed him, and so he had to do this. But Luther's own fiancée, Connie, had ultimately told the Boise police that Luther was the one who had cut Keith and Anita's phone lines a few months back before the murder. And she said she knew Luther had actually flown to Florida on the weekend of the murder, using an alias and fake social security number that he had gotten from his coworker. And once the Boise police finished speaking with Connie, they immediately called Detective Short in Florida to tell him what they'd just learned. It turned out there was no second suspect. It was just Luther. So 12-year-old Jason had just been wrong about the killer's appearance, and Anita had been wrong about not knowing who they were. As for that hair that had been found inside the black ski mask that Luther had been wearing, it's unclear how that was there. It wasn't Luther's hair, but it's possible that maybe somebody else had put the mask on at some point, and that's how it got there. Luther Bass was arrested in Boise, Idaho on March 6, 1992, and he confessed to the crime on the same day. A year later, he was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary with an assault. He was sentenced to life plus 30 years in prison. As for Anita, she would recover from her injuries. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen Podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. You think you're safe when you're at home, but today's two stories prove you might not be. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Who's Out There? And it's about a woman's worst nightmare that unfolds at a cabin in the woods. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Denver Spider-Man, and it's about a very unsettling secret that was found inside of a locked house. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is looking to adopt a pet, tell them you just rescued a puppy and you'd love for them to take it. But don't tell them when you say puppy, you actually mean enormous saltwater crocodile. Okay, let's get into our first story called Who's Out There? On the night of October 17, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half-mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo, and so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious, and so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these two eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the two eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash, they turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin, and it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you. But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911 and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something.
And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend. And so she called her boyfriend. And as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion and then coming back in, hearing the sound and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, "Look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go." And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, "Thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police." And so the friend said, "Okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police." And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, "Hey, sorry, there is no issue here. Don't call the police." But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point. Then her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And all Ada could think to do was yell out, "There's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." And the friend is screaming, "I'm gonna call the police." And then the line goes dead. And Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least two gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. There were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing. And Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. There were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go, she must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication, but after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog to clear her head and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert. which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her. And then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection, but again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state, and so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her, but again, it's just her reflection. And so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person and then didn't see anybody. And then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers. And then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Denver Spider-Man. On October 17, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital, and so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized, nothing in the house was stolen, and Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you gotta remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles such as theft, vandalism, revenge have basically been crossed off. Not to mention there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches for the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams, and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back, and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so 2 detectives go and they're sitting outside, and for a couple of days, they're not seeing anything. They're not hearing anything. And they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around, they don't see anything, they go back downstairs. And as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in. They both grab this person and they yank this person out, and they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Conies, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Conies moved in, he had fallen on hard times, he was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend, Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip, and so the house was vacant. And Conies saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first, his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take, that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little, almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Conies saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Conies would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, and go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Conies leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going to the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" In a panic, Conies grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio, curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Conies was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One September afternoon in 2003, a woman in Tucson, Arizona heard a knock on her front door, and she answered it. And she was surprised to see a Tucson police detective standing on her front steps, and even more surprised when he started asking her a bunch of questions about her next-door neighbor. Now, the woman tried to be as helpful as she could, but, she just didn't have very good answers to this detective's questions. She really didn't know much about her neighbor. And so ultimately, the detective gave her his business card and told her to call back if she ever heard anything or saw anything or remembered anything unusual about her neighbor. Now, this woman didn't expect to ever call this detective back. That was until a few days later when she looked out her window and saw two sweaty men jump out of a van and walk up the steps into her neighbor's house. And the woman just stood there for several minutes, absolutely shocked, her heart racing, realizing what she was watching. Moments later, the woman picked up that business card and called the detective. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please secretly attach a harmonica to the front of the Follow Button's car so that everywhere they go, their car whistles. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Wednesday, September 24, 2003, 45-year-old Michael Alberto Jaquez laid down flat on his back on his yoga mat in front of a room full of his students at a yoga studio in downtown Tucson, Arizona. The students all followed Michael's lead, laying down for a pose called Shavasana, which signaled the end of a long workout. Michael loved this final pose because it was all about meditation, and it really helped him get centered for his day. And after a few minutes in this pose, when he sat up and told his students to rise as well, he felt both exhausted and recharged. He got to his feet and smiled at his class as everyone else rolled up their yoga mats and got ready to leave. Although Michael was a machinist by trade and spent his workdays in his shop tinkering with tools and small engines, he was actually a very artistic and kind of zen person. He spent his free time giving music lessons on his guitar, and he also taught 15 different yoga classes every week in various gyms and studios all across Tucson. His genuine enthusiasm about the physical, mental, and spiritual benefits of yoga were very infectious, and it put many of his students at ease around him. In fact, they were so comfortable with him that they called him MAD, which was short for his three initials, Michael Alberto Jaquez. Michael toweled the sweat off his face and looked up at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 p.m., and his stomach was beginning to rumble. So he asked the class as they were getting ready to go if anybody was feeling up to grabbing some food and a few drinks, which was actually a question they were all expecting, because hanging out socially was something that this Wednesday group typically did each week after their workout. One student immediately shouted out that they would, and a few others raised their hands as well. So Michael suggested they all meet at a bar on 4th Avenue, not far from where the yoga studio was located. The students that were going all nodded their heads in agreement, and then all of them, the ones who were going and the ones who were not, all shuffled through the studio's door and outside to the parking lot. But before Michael shut off the studio lights and followed the group outside, he picked up his cell phone and called his girlfriend, Amber Trudell. He'd been seeing her off and on for about a year after first meeting her through his yoga lessons. Recently, things had been a bit rocky between Amber and Michael, but Michael still wanted to invite her out for dinner and drinks. He figured that by having her be a part of a big group setting out at a public place, that would sort of give them a chance to have fun without the opportunity to argue, since if they argued, it would be in front of everyone, so that was a natural deterrent. After a few rings, Amber answered her phone, and Michael told her very enthusiastically about his plans and said that he would love it if she came out with them. But Amber hesitated, and Michael frankly knew why. In addition to the problems they were having in their relationship, Amber was just a very shy person. She preferred private lessons with Michael rather than being a part of a big group where you had all these other people sort of watching you stretch for an hour. But after a few seconds of awkward silence on the line, Amber said that she actually would meet up with Michael and his students at the bar. Michael was thrilled and told Amber he would see her there. Then he ended the call, shut off the lights in the studio, and walked out the door into the parking lot, thinking about Amber. Michael and Amber were opposites, but that didn't really bother Michael. It also didn't bother him when Amber teased him about how he dressed like a hippie with his long hair and beaded necklace and sandals. Michael could take a joke, and above all, he liked to have fun, which in his mind was what he was doing with an attractive woman like Amber, who was actually 17 years younger than he was. Their relationship really was pretty casual, and Michael intended to keep it that way. He'd been married twice already, and was a father to 3 kids, as well as a grandfather. And at this point in his life, he did not want to be tied down anymore. Amber, on the other hand, she did want to get serious. She kept asking Michael to marry her, and every few weeks, she'd break up with him for saying no. And so Michael knew that their relationship status would likely come up tonight in conversation. But since there were other people going out with them, he figured maybe he could dodge an argument about it. A few minutes later, Michael walked into the bar on 4th Street and found 5 of his students already sitting at a table. He sat down and ordered a drink, and shortly after that, Michael looked up to see Amber walk in through the front door of the bar. He stood up from the table, gave her a big hug, and then invited her to take a spot right next to him. From that point on, the group ordered some food, and they drank and talked and goofed around until around 8:30 at night when folks started getting tired. At that point, they all paid their checks, and then they left. Now, most of the students were heading home at this point, but Michael, Amber, and one of the students, Michael's friend Eli, decided to continue their night and go have a few more drinks at another bar. So the 3 of them went to another establishment until around 10 p.m. And at that point, Eli decided it was time for him to call it a night. He took some cash from his wallet, put it down on the table, and then he headed home, leaving just Michael and Amber at the bar. And now that the couple was all alone, just as Michael expected, they began to fight. And so Michael began drinking faster and ordering more drinks for Amber, hoping that maybe more alcohol for both of them would mellow them out. 2 hours later, at midnight, when the bartender turned the lights off and then back on again and then announced out loud it was last call, both Michael and Amber were pretty drunk. Michael yawned, finished the rest of the drink in his glass, and asked Amber to come back to his house with him. She said she would, and so Michael and Amber paid their tab and then walked out the front door into the night. Shortly afterwards, the 2 of them stumbled up the walkway and onto the front porch of Michael's house at 2602 North Sparkman Boulevard. Michael unlocked the door, and then he and Amber stepped into the kitchen. A day and a half later, on Friday, September 26th, at around 6:30 in the morning, a woman was walking her dog along North Sparkman Boulevard in Tucson. The street was in a pretty rough neighborhood where there were lots of burglaries and muggings, and so most people kind of kept to themselves when they were passing through. Usually, the woman walked her dog at a fast pace with her head down, avoiding eye contact with other pedestrians and avoiding looking into other people's properties. However, when the woman passed in front of number 2602, something caught her attention. Just beyond some brush obscuring the front patio, she saw a flash of something light-colored, that was obviously not vegetation. She turned her head to look and blinked for a second in confusion, because what she was looking at didn't make sense. It was a person's bare legs in shorts splayed out on the patio. Now, the weather had been excruciatingly hot and muggy and stifling for the last few days, including today, so the woman at first thought that maybe this person up on the porch had passed out from the heat. Now, as soon as she thought that, her first instinct was to walk up and investigate and make sure this person was okay. But since this was not really a safe neighborhood, the idea of just strolling up to some stranger's property seemed kind of risky. But just then, she saw another man walking on the street towards his car, and she called out to him and pointed over at the legs on the patio and asked if he would go see what was the matter. The man looked over at the house and saw what the woman was pointing at, and sort of looked puzzled for a second. Then he turned back to the woman and gave a thumbs up, like, "Yep, I'll go check it out." Then the man walked over to the porch. The woman watched as the man walked up to the porch, and right as he got close to the legs, he called out the name Michael. And then the man who was doing this checkup, he began backing up, and then he turned and actually started running back towards the woman, and as he passed her, he just said, "I'm calling 911. Not long after that man called 911, Detective Ben Jimenez of the Tucson Police Department drove down North Sparkman Boulevard in his cruiser. He came to a stop just outside of number 2602, put his cruiser in park, and cut the engine. Around him, he saw other squad cars and ambulances doing the same thing. Jimenez stepped out of his air-conditioned cruiser into the hot, muggy morning air. He took off his suit jacket and tossed it onto the driver's seat, and then shut the door. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, loosened his tie, and then walked from the curb up to the porch of the house, until he was standing next to the dead body of a man who was lying face up and wearing yoga pants and a tank top. Jimenez was not the first member of the Tucson PD on the scene, and one of the other officers who was already there told him that the body he was looking at belonged to the home's resident, who was named Michael Dojaquez. The officer told Jimenez that the rest of the property was empty. Michael was their only victim. Jimenez put on a pair of disposable gloves and squatted down next to the body. He could see there was a single bullet wound in the center of Michael's forehead. Around the bullet wound, Jimenez could see a black star-shaped gunpowder burn. There was lots of dried blood on the porch floor around the head, and more blood on Michael's clothes and legs. Jimenez mentioned to the officer to be on the lookout for any shell casings. Then Jimenez put his hand up to Michael's exposed skin and found that it was actually still warm. The fact the body had not gone cold yet suggested that Michael may have been killed only a few hours earlier, probably in the early hours of Friday morning. Jimenez looked at Michael's hands and saw that they were covered in scratches, which told him that Michael very likely must have fought with his attacker. Jimenez stood back up, but just as he was about to walk inside the house, he stopped, because he noticed that some guitar and violin cases were haphazardly stacked up outside on the porch. And this struck him as odd, because nobody in this neighborhood would ever store expensive musical equipment outside, or really anything sort of like obviously expensive outside, because it could get stolen. But regardless, Jimenez stepped through the front door and into the kitchen, and as he did, he saw more music gear. This time it was an amplifier and a guitar stand that had been left to the side of the door just inside the house. On the floor near the gear, Jimenez saw broken glass from a shattered window pane. And so already, Jimenez was beginning to develop a theory. He wondered if maybe Michael had interrupted a robbery. Maybe the thief or thieves had been in the process of shuffling the musical equipment out of the house onto the porch, kind of stacking it up near the door as they were doing it, when Michael came out and then confronted them. The broken glass in the kitchen suggested that the fight maybe started there, or at least in part happened right there, and then from there, they moved through the door onto the porch where Michael was ultimately shot. And then when Jimenez did a walkthrough of the rest of the property, he found in Michael's workshop that it was perfectly intact and none of the very obviously expensive tools had been taken or moved. And so to Jimenez, this cemented his theory that very likely Michael had interrupted a robbery. And so very likely, at least according to Jimenez's theory, after the robber shot Michael, he figured that they must have panicked and then just taken off without finishing the job. By this point, the crime scene was swarming with members of the forensics unit and also uniformed officers. Jimenez knew it would take hours to process the scene for blood, fingerprints, and other trace evidence, And also, officers were already out knocking on doors in the neighborhood looking for witnesses. So Jimenez decided to leave and go talk to detectives in the burglary division to see if they had any similar cases or usual suspects. Back inside of headquarters, Detective Jimenez walked quickly to the burglary division. He rapped on the open door of one of the offices there and caught the attention of a detective at a desk. Jimenez explained the case he just caught, laid out his theory about a home robbery gone wrong, and then asked the detective if he had any recent robberies on or around North Sparkman Boulevard. And the second Jimenez mentioned North Sparkman Boulevard, he saw this detective's eyes light up. He shot straight up in his chair and very excitedly said that yes, he did in fact have something. Just 5 days earlier, on Sunday, he had arrested two men, Joseph Keyes and David Wynn, for robbing a home in that exact same neighborhood. But that wasn't all. First of all, Keyes and Wynn lived in a house that was just a mile away from Michael's place, and, most importantly, one of the items these two men had stolen was a guitar. Jimenez knew this was a great starting point, so he got Keyes and Wynn's home address from the detective. Then Jimenez returned to his own desk and began filling out an application for a search warrant. While he waited for a judge to approve his request, Jimenez's phone rang. It was one of the officers who'd been knocking on doors over on North Sparkman Boulevard. The officer told Jimenez that nobody in the area heard any gunshots or any unusual noises coming from Michael's house early on Friday morning. And nobody seemed to have seen Michael at all for a day or two. However, one neighbor told police that on Thursday afternoon, Michael must have been working in his workshop because they'd heard his compressor going. So, the neighborhood canvas had not produced a witness to the killing, but they were starting to build a picture of Michael's final hours. Jimenez thanked the officer for the good work and hung up the phone, feeling satisfied. Less than one full day into his investigation, and he already had a very promising working theory, he had a search warrant application out to a judge, and he was refining, his victim's final moments to really get a sense of what actually happened here. But for now, it was late in the evening, and he knew he had a long day ahead of him tomorrow. So he shut down his computer and left his office. The next morning was Saturday, and Detective Jimenez arrived at his office to find that his search warrant application for the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn had been approved. He also found a copy of the autopsy report waiting for him, along with a couple of reports from other detectives who had begun to reach out to Michael's friends and family. Now, Jimenez was very eager to go search Wynn and Keyes' house, but first he picked up the autopsy report, flipped it open, and gave it a quick read. The coroner had found a .38 caliber bullet lodged in Michael's brain. The star-shaped gunpowder burn around the entry wound meant it had been fired at close range, which Jimenez had already guessed. And also the coroner noted that the wounds on Michael's hands were indeed very likely defensive wounds. The most useful part of the report focused on Michael's time of death. When Jimenez got to the scene and he touched Michael's body, it was warm to the touch, and so he had assumed that very likely Michael had died recently. Jimenez just didn't know exactly when. And the coroner was able to confirm that suspicion. Because Michael had not yet gone through rigor mortis, the coroner was able to establish an actual time of death. Michael had been shot somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday morning. And so this information meant that Jimenez could be very specific when he was investigating suspect alibis. This was great news. Jimenez rifled through the other reports, which laid out a rough timeline of Michael's activities before his death. He had taught a yoga class on Wednesday night and gone out for drinks afterwards with some students and a girlfriend who Michael's friends knew only as Amber. Then on Thursday, he'd apparently spent the entire day holed up inside of his studio working. Jimenez put the reports down. He'd have to work on tracking down Amber later, but for now, that was not his priority. Instead, he gathered up a team of officers and drove over to the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn. When they got there, they knocked on the door, they didn't get an answer, and so eventually they forced their way inside, and immediately they discovered that there was nobody home. However, pretty quickly, once Jimenez walked into the kitchen, he knew coming to this house had put him on the right track, because in the kitchen, there was this very random-looking pile of clothes. Jimenez put on his gloves, squatted down, and one by one, he picked up a bandana, a pair of pants, and some shoes. And he saw that every item in this pile was splattered with blood. Jimenez was thinking that at this point, all he would need to do to close his case was get these items over to forensics and match the blood on these to the blood of his victim. But the next morning, when Jimenez walked into his office, He got two pieces of bad news, one right after the next. The first piece of bad news was that the forensics did not match. The blood found on the bandana, the pants, and the shoes was the wrong type. It didn't belong to Michael. And the second piece of bad news was that even though Joseph Keyes and David Wynn appeared to be the perfect suspects on paper for this murder, robbery detectives had found one big problem. When Michael was shot early on Friday morning, Keyes and Wynn were both already sitting inside of a jail cell. And so, just 2 days after Michael's body was found, Detective Jimenez found himself back at square one. Jimenez sat at his desk, flipping through reports from the crime scene, and hoping he'd stumble upon a detail that maybe he missed. And after about an hour of doing that, he did find something. On a list of items found inside of Michael's house, Jimenez saw a cell phone. At this time, in 2003, not everybody had a cell phone yet, so it wasn't something police immediately looked for when they arrived on a crime scene. Also, cell phones at this time did not contain the kind of evidence that they would today. There was no internet access on any of them, and people didn't send a whole bunch of text messages or really use them nearly as much as we do now. So Jimenez got up from his desk and walked to the evidence room to get the cell phone. And once he had it, he went straight to the single most useful piece of information the phone contained. And that was the call log. The detective began scrolling through the list of people Michael had spoken to before he died. And at the top of that list was the phone number for a contact listed as Amber Trudell. Jimenez read the name and immediately felt a jolt of excitement. Michael's friends had said that his girlfriend was named Amber. He had meant to track her down, and now he was staring down at, very likely, her phone number. Jimenez took the cell phone and went back to his desk. There, he used his own phone to dial Amber's phone number, but there was no answer. It just rang and finally went to voicemail, which was very disappointing. So Jimenez left a voicemail and asked Amber to please call him back at her earliest convenience. After he hung up, Jimenez just stared at the call history list again, and as he did, he noticed something curious. Michael had been killed on Friday morning, but his last call, which was to Amber, was made on Wednesday night. It seemed bizarre to Jimenez that there was this weird gap in time leading up to Michael's death. It was hard to imagine that all day Thursday, Michael hadn't spoken to anyone. And as he thought about this, he also found it to be kind of suspicious that Amber had not already come forward to talk to the police, considering that her boyfriend had been murdered. And so Jimenez began dialing numbers from Michael's contact list in his phone, including Michael's ex-wives and his adult kids, asking about Amber, looking for any information he could. But it seemed like no one really had any information about who this person was and what her role was in Michael's life. So, by the time Sunday came to a close, Jimenez had a new hunch about where he should focus his investigation: on his victim's girlfriend, Amber. The next morning, on Monday, when Amber still had not returned Jimenez's phone calls, he tried her again. And this time, his call went straight to voicemail instead of ringing like it had the day before. This meant her phone had shut off. Jimenez wasn't sure what to make of this. It was possible that Amber's cell phone had simply run out of batteries. In 2003, that wasn't that unusual to have your phone die and just sort of go without your phone for a while. Also, people did periodically just turn their phone off and not return calls. It was just a different time. But with every hour that went by that day without getting a call back from Amber, Jimenez couldn't help but get more suspicious. Finally, the next day on Tuesday, Jimenez got a phone call. When he picked it up, he hoped it was going to be Amber. But it wasn't Amber. It was Amber's boss, who Jimenez didn't know and had not called. And Amber's boss, who said she had heard about the murder on TV, had a story that changed everything Jimenez thought he knew about this case. The boss said that Amber worked for her as a bookkeeper at a charity called Child and Family Resources. And Amber was usually very reliable. But on Thursday, so a day before the murder, Amber had called out of work for what she said was a family emergency. She had been supposed to return a day ago, on Monday, but she hadn't shown up. And so Jimenez scribbled all this down, thinking that Amber did seem to make a pretty good suspect after all. But then Amber's boss said there was one more thing. Amber's relationship with Michael was not a typical boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. It was an affair. Amber was married. Less than an hour later, Detective Jimenez walked into the air-conditioned bagel shop where Amber's boss had said that Amber's husband worked. After he had wrapped up the call with Amber's boss, Jimenez was left with a feeling of whiplash. Until her boss had told him about the husband, he had been viewing Amber as a possible suspect, and a good one. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was some kind of a victim. After all, right now she was still unaccounted for, nobody had heard from her, and this affair certainly gave her husband a very solid motive to potentially harm her, or harm Michael, or both. All Amber's boss had known about Amber's husband was his name, Justin Goodwin, and his place of employment, this bagel shop. However, when Jimenez asked the employee at the counter if Justin Goodwin was working, the employee looked surprised and kind of nervous, and just shook his head and said no. Then he told Jimenez to wait and left the counter to go into an office in the back. And then after a minute, another man walked out to the counter and introduced himself as the manager. And he told Jimenez that he was sorry, but Justin had worked here, but he quit his job very suddenly just the day before. To Jimenez, it was sort of head-spinning how quickly this new theory that Justin could be involved here was picking up steam. So he asked the manager if he knew anything about Justin's wife, Amber. And the manager made a sort of pained expression. He told Jimenez that all he knew was that their relationship seemed very tumultuous. In fact, Justin had once missed work because he'd been arrested for domestic violence. Jimenez could barely contain his eagerness as he asked the manager for Justin's address. Then, after he got it, he left the bagel shop and sped to the home of his new prime suspect. But when Jimenez arrived, the lights were off in the house. The driveway was empty, and nobody answered the door. And so Jimenez walked around to a few of the nearby houses and spoke to the neighbors, sweating in the heat the whole time, but they all said that they hadn't seen Amber or Justin for at least a few days. Disappointed, Jimenez gave them all his card and asked them to call him if they remembered anything or if they saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. For the next 3 days, Jimenez and his team searched for Amber and Justin and put out notifications to neighboring police departments to be on the lookout for them. But he didn't make any progress until Friday, October 3rd, exactly 1 week after the murder, when one of the neighbors whose doors he had knocked on called him back. It was a woman, and she sounded breathless and excited. She told Jimenez that he had to come back to Justin's house right now, because at this very moment, she was standing at her window and watching as Justin and another man were taking all the furniture out of Justin's home and loading it into a rental van. Jimenez immediately ran out of his office, hopped in his cruiser, and he sped over to Justin's house. And when he got there, he saw a man who he instantly recognized from the mugshots as Justin himself. And just like the neighbor had said, Justin clearly was taking furniture from his house and putting it into this van. Jimenez hopped out of his cruiser, quickly identified himself as a detective, and asked Justin what he was doing and where his wife was. Immediately, Justin looked nervous. He told Jimenez he was moving, which certainly wasn't illegal, and as for his wife, he said he had no idea. He said they were getting a divorce, and she was on her own. Then Justin did something that caught Jimenez totally by surprise. It was swelteringly hot outside, and at some point Justin lifted up his shirt to wipe the sweat off his face. And when he did, Jimenez saw tucked in Justin's waistband was a gun. Now, Jimenez had no idea if Justin had a license to carry this gun, but considering the entire circumstances, it was too much to overlook. And he told Justin he had to come down to the station and answer some questions. Once they were at the station, Jimenez led Justin into an interview room. At this point, the red flags around Justin were almost comically conspicuous. He had been arrested for domestic violence in the past, his wife was having an affair and now she was missing, and her affair partner had been shot to death. Justin had quit his job and cleaned out the house where he and Amber lived, all while armed with a gun. So when Jimenez sat down at the table inside of this interview room, he felt pretty confident that he had his killer right in front of him. Jimenez handed Justin a bottle of water and then began asking him questions, starting with, did he know a man named Michael Dohaquez? Jimenez watched as Justin took the cap off his water and raised it to his mouth before answering, and he saw that Justin's hand was visibly shaking. After a second, Justin just said no, he didn't know anybody by that name. When Jimenez followed up and said that Michael and Amber were having an affair, Justin denied knowing that too. He said that he and Amber clearly were having problems, they were getting a divorce, but those problems had nothing to do with anybody named Michael. He swore again that he really had no idea where Amber was, and insisted that all of the incriminating facts that seemed to surround him were just a coincidence. Right as Jimenez was starting to get frustrated with Justin, feeling like he was blatantly lying to him, there was a knock on the interview room door. Jimenez turned around to see another officer step inside, holding up Justin's cell phone, which they had confiscated along with Justin's gun when they questioned him. The officer apologized for interrupting, but asked Jimenez if he could please step out of the room and speak to him for a moment. Jimenez got up and left the interview room, and the officer handed him Justin's cell phone. He explained that the whole time Jimenez had been questioning Justin, it had been ringing incessantly, and finally he had just picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, and she had hung up as soon as he, the officer, had identified himself as police. However, the officer had traced the phone number and found that it belonged to the Extended Stay America Hotel right there in Tucson. Jimenez could not believe his luck. Whoever that was calling Justin, if he could just catch them before they left that hotel, they might be able to give him some real answers about what Justin had been up to for the past few days. So Jimenez asked the officer to keep an eye on Justin because he was going to go track down this mystery caller. A half an hour later, Jimenez was offering a pleasant but very impatient smile to the employee behind the front desk at the Extended Stay America Hotel. The detective had no way of knowing what room the mystery calls had come from, so the employee was looking it up for him, but it was taking forever. Finally, though, the employee looked up and said he did have a woman staying in the room where the calls came from, and the employee said that woman's name was Amber Trudell. Detective Jimenez would take Amber back to the police station and would spend the next several hours untangling her story and Justin's. The detective's murder case was changing faster than he could even keep up with. First, it had looked like a robbery, and he'd had 2 slam-dunk suspects, but that had fallen apart in days. Then he had Amber Trudell, the suspicious girlfriend, who he thought maybe was dodging his calls because she was guilty, but Amber had turned out to be missing, and a possible victim. That revelation had given him Justin Goodwin, the jealous husband, but just as Jimenez had thought he was closing in on Justin for killing Michael and maybe even Amber too, Amber herself had reappeared, holed up in a hotel, and calling Justin over and over again. Whatever Justin and Amber were relationship-wise, they apparently were not totally broken up yet. And so now Jimenez was considering yet another theory, that maybe Justin and Amber had killed Michael together. He figured he could put them both in separate interview rooms, take each of their statements, and then grill them on the inconsistencies that he was absolutely certain he was going to find. But that didn't happen. To Jimenez's shock, Justin and Amber's stories matched each other perfectly. Yes, they said they were having marital problems, and yes, they saw how suspicious all their behavior looked. Between Justin quitting his job and lying to police about where Amber was, and Amber abandoning her job and ignoring all of Jimenez's calls while hiding in a hotel, but they swore they didn't kill Michael, and they had alibis to prove it. Because on Thursday morning, so almost a full 24 hours before the murder, they had left Tucson, headed 3.5 hours north to a mountain town called Sholo, Arizona, where Justin's mother and stepfather lived. They told Jimenez to call Justin's parents and check for himself. And so Jimenez did just that, not really sure what to expect. He didn't really have high hopes here that they were going to actually be able to confirm their alibi. But it would turn out that Justin's stepfather, he was a retired police detective, and he was very straightforward and specific about the timeline. And even though this kind of poked a hole in his whole case, Jimenez believed him. And so this meant that between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday, when Michael was shot to death, Amber and Justin were almost 200 miles away. And not only that, but Justin's gun, that had been such a red flag, was not the same caliber as the murder weapon. And so Jimenez's best suspects were just more dead ends. Jimenez let Amber and Justin leave the police station, and he went back to his desk, where he slumped in his chair and stared miserably at nothing. By now, it was late in the day, and Jimenez had no new ideas. His case was turning out to be much more complicated than he had initially thought, and now nothing was making any sense. And so he figured, what he really needed to do now was just take the weekend and look at the case with fresh eyes on Monday. There had to be something he was missing, some piece of evidence that he was either misinterpreting or missing altogether. He decided he would make one more phone call and then head home. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed the number for the coroner's office. And like he expected, on a Friday night, nobody picked up. So he left a voicemail asking the coroner to take one more look at all the Michael Dohakwa's evidence. He explained he wasn't totally sure what he was looking for, but something just didn't feel right, and he wanted the coroner to look really closely one more time so that he had sort of a good starting point on Monday. Then Jimenez hung up the phone, picked up his jacket, and headed home. The tip that would break this case wide open came early the following week, but the tip didn't come from the coroner. It was a phone call from someone Detective Jimenez had spoken to already in this investigation, and who he never expected to hear from again. This person said that Jimenez had to come meet with them right now, and Jimenez didn't hesitate, because what this person had to say didn't make sense with the rest of the evidence that the detective had. But the detective no longer trusted all of his evidence. He was sure there was something wrong with his facts, he just wasn't sure what it was, and so maybe this was part of it. Jimenez drove out to meet the person who called him, and the person took him for a walk. They said they wanted to show him a hole that they had found in the dirt. And when Jimenez got to that hole, he stood there panting in the warm air, and he realized that finally, he knew who his murderer was. He just had to figure out how this was possible. And this is where the coroner came in. Because shortly after Jimenez got back to the station, the coroner called to tell Jimenez that he had been right. They had all misinterpreted one very important piece of evidence. The truth had been right in front of them all along. They just hadn't put it together. Based on evidence collected over the course of a few weeks and the revised results of the autopsy, this is what police believe happened to Michael Dohaquez on the morning that he was killed. It was 1:30 in the morning, and Michael had just confronted his killer in the messy kitchen of his home. The killer was enraged, and the two of them were standing near the sink, shouting at each other. At some point, the killer grabbed a glass and threw it at Michael, but Michael managed to dodge it, and the glass hit a window pane near the front door, shattering glass all over the ground. Michael was about to step towards the killer to stop them from throwing anything else at him, but there was something he didn't realize. The killer was hiding a revolver. And suddenly the killer drew their weapon, and when Michael saw it, he rushed forward to try to wrench it out of their hands. They struggled, but Michael couldn't get a hold of the gun, and they wrestled together out the front door, and then the killer fired. Michael fell backwards onto the patio, dead. At this point, the killer looked up and down North Sparkman Boulevard to make sure nobody was around, and when they were sure they were good, they took off running into the warm summer night. It would turn out all of Jimenez's suspects, Joseph Keyes, David Wynn, Justin Goodwin, and Amber Trudell, did have alibis for Friday, September 26th, between 2 and 3 a.m., which was when the police thought Michael had been murdered. But law enforcement was wrong about Michael's time of death. The heat had fooled them. Michael was not shot to death early on Friday morning, September 26th. He was shot to death early on Thursday morning, September 25th. His body was warm when Detective Jimenez reached down to touch his skin because it had been very hot and muggy outside the whole time he was lying there. The coroner thought the body temperature, combined with the flexibility of the body, meant that death had been recent and that rigor mortis had not begun. But in reality, a hot and moist environment can cause rigor mortis to happen more quickly after death and last for a shorter period of time. So in reality, Michael's rigor mortis had already come and gone by the time Jimenez touched his body. And so the reason he was sort of flaccid feeling is because he no longer was in rigor mortis. And so when the coroner had gone back over the evidence at Detective Jimenez's request, he found something he had missed. Michael's body had larvae in its eyes, which was an indication that he had been dead for a lot longer than a few hours. And when police went back to the crime scene, they realized that the compressor the neighbor had heard on Thursday, which caused them to think that Michael was alive and well and working in a shop that day, was actually set to refill automatically. So that noise had not meant anything at all. It did not mean that Michael was in there at work. And so the adjustment of the time of death from Friday to Thursday morning allowed Jimenez to make sense of that final phone call he got from the person he had already spoken to, who called him asking to meet. That person was Justin's stepfather, the retired police officer. The stepfather had been telling the truth about the timing of Justin and Amber's visit, and that had ruled them out as suspects when the belief was Michael had been killed on Friday. But after he had gotten off the phone with Jimenez, the stepfather had followed a hunch out to the back of his property where he discovered a hole in the dirt. And inside that hole was the murder weapon. But the person who hid that gun was not Justin. It was his soon-to-be ex-wife, Amber Trudell. On Friday, October 10th, an arrest warrant and a nationwide alert was issued for Amber, who had fled Tucson. U.S. Marshals arrested Amber at her grandmother's house in New York. During her trial in March of 2005, Amber claimed that Michael sexually assaulted her on the night he was killed, and that he himself was actually the one who pulled the trigger during their struggle, which resulted in him being shot and killed. However, she was still convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. On October 19, 2016, Amber was released from prison, having served out her entire sentence. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the Mr. Ballen podcast, as well as Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 camping horror stories. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Kevin O'Keefe, and it's about a man who goes camping in a totally remote park in Alaska. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Broken Tent, and it's about 4 teenagers who go camping in a forest in Finland, but on the first night, someone or something pays them an unwanted visit. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to change the oil in the Amazon Music follow button's car, but after draining it all out, go ahead and replace it with horse manure. Okay, let's get into our first story called Kevin O'Keefe.
In 1985, Kevin O'Keefe was a 36-year-old outdoor enthusiast that lived in Sacramento, California. He loved being out in nature, going hiking and camping, and in fact, he had always wanted to go camping in Alaska. By the summer of 1985, Kevin was actually doing research on areas in Alaska that he could potentially go camping, and he settled on this area called Glacier Bay National Park, which even by Alaskan standards is particularly wild and totally remote. Kevin planned to go camping on his own, so he decided he would need to take a class on how to survive the Alaskan wilderness because he's going to be out there by himself and he's chosen this place that's incredibly rugged. So he actually enrolled and participated in a class teaching you how to go camping in Alaska. Then on September 20th of 1985, he flew from Sacramento to Juneau, Alaska, where he commuted his way up to Glacier Bay National Park. When he arrived at the park's headquarters, he went up and introduced himself to the park rangers that were working there. He told them he'd be over near the Wolf Point area, which was an area right against the water, and he said he was going to be here for about 3 weeks. He planned on leaving on October 10th. So everybody who works there is aware that there's this guy, Kevin O'Keefe, who's going to be by himself for almost 3 weeks camping near the water. No one in Kevin's family or any of the park rangers heard from Kevin for the next couple of weeks. But the whole point of this trip was basically to escape reality and go live in nature for a few weeks, so no one's raising any red flags.
A few weeks later, on October 8th, which is 2 days before Kevin said he was planning to leave the park, which he told park rangers and they knew he was there, a couple of park rangers were in a boat patrolling some waterways around Wolf Point, which is the area where Kevin was camping. The rangers decided to take a bit of a detour to get inside of Wolf Point and actually check in on Kevin and just see how he was doing, because they knew he was out here by himself. They're making their way down, and as they turned this last corner where they could finally see Kevin's sight, immediately they knew something was wrong. The first thing they noticed was Kevin's tent was not in the area that it was supposed to be in. There was kind of a designated spot on the soil where you'd place your tent, but his tent was actually down a few meters on this beach that butted up against his campsite, and some of his gear was outside of his tent. Not strewn everywhere, but outside of his tent, like you had placed it outside. As they're looking at his tent, they realized that the top strut that kind of held the top of the tent together was folded down. It looked like it had broken right in the middle. They called out for Kevin. He was nowhere around, and they kind of rationalized what they saw. They thought, he's leaving in a couple of days. My guess is he's probably preparing his campsite for an exit. Maybe he went out to, go on a day hike or something. I'm sure everything is fine. So they leave and come back the next day just to double check. And when they arrive, there's been no change. The tent is still sitting down on the beach with that strut collapsed. His gear is sitting outside of his tent like a sleeping bag and sleeping pad. It's clear that Kevin has not been to this campsite since the last time they saw him, which was 24 hours earlier. So now they're outright concerned and they decide to launch a search for Kevin. They began flying little airplanes over the area where Kevin's campsite was and the surrounding areas. No sign of Kevin. They brought ground searchers with dogs onto his campsite. They're looking everywhere. No sign of Kevin. But they did discover at his campsite that virtually all of the equipment you would expect to be at a campsite in Alaska of someone who's staying there for a few weeks, well, it was all there. He had his backpack fully packed as if he was going to go on a hike. It had food, it had extra clothes and water. It was all packed right up against a tree. All of his sleeping equipment and his cooking equipment. And oddly, there was lots of food that Kevin still had left at his campsite that was out in the open. And no animals had touched it, which is a complete anomaly. As they began searching the outer areas of his campsite, dogs were able to locate Kevin's boots, his glove liner, and his hat. They were tucked away in this gully about a half-mile away from this campsite. They were not visible to the naked eye. It took dogs finding it to locate these items. After finding these items, the early speculation was it looks like Kevin was attacked by bears or some other predator. But the park rangers, who knew this area extremely well and had seen other bear attacks, said, I don't think this is a bear attack, because there's no sign of a death struggle anywhere at his camp. If you get attacked by a big predator, you're going to fight for your life to save yourself. You're going to grab onto things and flail around. It's fairly obvious, and there's none of that. There's also no blood or remains or any indication that someone was hurt in this space. And if an animal had come into this camp and attacked Kevin and eaten Kevin, they certainly would have taken the food that was out and about in the campsite, but none of the food was touched. As the investigation continued, rangers would say how strange it was that no wild animals are coming into this campsite. There's no activity. There's nothing in the area. It's like the animals are staying away from Kevin's campsite. When they couldn't find any sign of Kevin, the investigators went to speak with Kevin's family and asked them, did he have any signs that he was looking to end his own life? Do you have any information you can give us about him? And they said, no, he was really happy, well-adjusted, excited about this trip. He had taken a class to prepare himself for this trip. He told us that he planned on taking a couple day hikes, but no overnights. And he had no plans to meet other people while he was there. He was just looking to be on his own in nature. But after just a few days, they had to call the search off because there was no sign of this guy. He was just gone. Knowing that all of Kevin's gear was still located at his campsite means he did not leave to go on one of those day hikes that he had told his family that he might be going on. Because going into the wilds of Alaska without your gear is a death sentence. So Kevin must have been at his campsite when something horrible happened to him. But we know it wasn't an animal attack because there was no sign of that and no animals were coming near this campsite. So if it wasn't an animal attack, then what was it that caused his tent to shift down to the beach and have his gear strewn about on the sand and have his boots and glove liner and hat be located a half-mile away in some gully? And where's Kevin? The next and final story of today's episode is called The Broken Tent. On the afternoon of June 4th, 1960, a 15-year-old girl named Mela Bjorklund climbed off the back of her boyfriend's motorcycle. Her boyfriend was an 18-year-old named Nils Gustafsson, and this couple had just driven 18 miles from the city in southern Finland where they lived to get to this beautiful forest and lake where they, along with another couple, were going to go camping. The other couple, who was still a few minutes behind them, was Nils's best friend, Seppo, and his girlfriend, whose name was Anja. As Nils parked his motorcycle, Mela looked out over the lake, and she saw it was totally beautiful, the forest completely wrapped around the lake, and there were all these people out on the lake, boating and swimming and having a great time. But despite all these people here, to Mela, it still kind of felt very quiet and peaceful. This didn't feel like a big touristy destination, it really felt like they were out in the wild. And for Mela, who loved the outdoors, this felt like a great spot to celebrate her 16th birthday, because that's actually why the couples were out camping. Mela was turning 16 in a couple of days, and so this was going to be her party. Just then, Mela heard another motorcycle approaching, and she turned around and she saw it was the other couple. It was Seppo who was driving, and Anja was right behind him. And Seppo, he looked up and saw Mela looking at him, and he grinned and braked hard with his motorcycle and kind of swung the back wheel out like he was in an action movie. And Mela thought it was totally funny and she started laughing, and that's when Nils turned around and he saw his girlfriend laughing heartily at Seppo. A moment later, all four friends were giving each other hugs and saying hello, and then after catching up, the friends walked over to this small shack that was right by the water. It was the snack kiosk. Their plan was to load up on supplies and then quickly make their way into the forest where they'd actually be camping and just relax, enjoy the night, and go to bed. But as the friends walked towards the snack kiosk, Seppo made a joke about how his motorcycle was way better than Nils's motorcycle. And Mela, who was Nils's boyfriend, she laughed at this joke and thought it was really funny. But as she was laughing, she happened to look over at Nils, her own boyfriend, and she could tell, he just looked upset, like he was scowling at her and also at Seppo. And immediately, Mela felt really bad because she was thinking, maybe Nils thinks I'm flirting with Seppo by laughing at all of his jokes. Now, keep in mind, Mela really liked Nils, and they had really just started dating, but for really the first time in Mela's life, she was dating someone who clearly liked her back. She had been in other kind of small relationships where it felt very one way, but this was different. And so Mela really did not want Nils to think anything was going on with her and Seppo, because there was nothing going on. But when Mela looked over at Nils again to kind of confirm that he really did look mad, he didn't look mad. He was smiling and laughing again. And so Mela told herself, she must have just imagined that Nils was never upset. It was all in her head. So Mela reached over and grabbed Nils's hand, and the two couples walked the rest of the way over to the kiosk. The snack kiosk was really just this little shack right near the beach, and then behind the shack was a small house where the owners of the snack kiosk lived. And as soon as they got up to the kiosk, Mela noticed the woman who was manning the kiosk had her back to them and didn't seem remotely interested in turning around and helping them get what they needed. And so Mela was just like, okay, hey, excuse me, we just want to buy something. And the woman at this point, she whipped her head around and she looked at Mela really angrily and just said, "What do you want?" And Mela, who was totally taken aback by this, she kind of mumbled an apology, not really even sure if she did something wrong or not. And then she asked the woman if they could just get a couple of beers and sodas and they'd be on their way. And as this is happening, Seppo and Anja, who were right behind Mela, they were just giggling the whole time. Because this woman's behavior was so bizarre and so unexpected, they just couldn't help themselves.
So as the teenagers are giggling, this woman is bending down and getting the sodas and beer, and she's huffing really angrily like this is such a huge inconvenience, and then she just slammed them up on the counter. As the woman was punching in the total into the cash register, Mela found herself looking over at the house behind the shack where this woman presumably lived, and Mela noticed there were all these empty beer bottles that lined the front railing of the house. And so Mela figured, maybe this was a clue as to why this woman was so hostile. Any household that produced that many empty beer cans likely was not a very happy place to live. And so finally, the woman in the kiosk gave the teenagers their total, at which point Nils stepped forward and he actually paid for the stuff instead of Mela. And then as Nils and Mela grabbed the things they bought and were about to turn and leave, the woman in the kiosk kind of cleared her voice and she asked them, hey, are you camping out by the lake? And to Mela, it seemed like this woman was suddenly being really nice, maybe as a way to kind of make up for how rude she was when they first walked over. And so Mela put on a smile and told this woman that, we're staying out by the lake. We're really excited about it. Thanks for asking. But the woman did not seem happy to hear this. Instead, the woman kind of scowled and then told them that they better set their tent as far away from here as possible. None of the teenagers had any idea how to respond to this. So they just kind of stood there, and there was this really intense, awkward silence for a moment, and then the kiosk lady just began literally shooing the teenagers away, telling them to go, get out of here. And so finally the teenagers did turn around and started walking, but after walking pretty far away from the kiosk, they heard the kiosk woman yell out at them one more time. She basically yelled at them that her and her family had already had lots of trouble with wild teenagers in the past, camping out around this lake. And so now she and her husband were totally sick of it. And so after the kiosk lady yelled out this final comment, Seppo and Nils and Anja, they just started laughing because it just seemed so absurd how disrespectful and awful this woman was being, to the point where it was comical. But Mela, she didn't think it was funny. She seemed mean and very angry, and it totally freaked Mela out. But just a couple of minutes later, the teens were back at their motorcycles, and Nils and Mela hopped on one, and Seppo and Anja hopped on the other, and then they began driving down this wooded path that would take them to their campsite. The ride to their campsite was a very short one, and where they were positioned was on this piece of land that sort of jutted out onto the lake. It was very heavily forested, and so it's this amazing view of the water, but it's very secluded in the trees. And so right away, Nils and Seppo, they parked their motorcycles up against the trees, they pulled out a simple canvas tent, and they strung it up between two birch trees, and then with their campsite all set up, they grabbed some beers, and the friends began to drink. And it didn't take long before Mela had totally forgotten about the kiosk woman and how awful she had been. After all, Mela had really been looking forward to this trip, and now she was here at the campsite, relaxing with her friends. I mean, this was great. Also, Mela was really excited about her relationship with Nils. It was a relatively new one, and it was obvious that, for once, her boyfriend was somebody who liked her as much as she liked him. And also, Nils was very handsome, and he was popular, and he had this dark brown hair that he combed straight up, and he always wore this leather jacket everywhere. And so Mela just really liked being around him. He was super cool and made her feel really grown up. After sitting around for about 30 minutes to an hour, just having a couple of drinks and swapping stories and kind of easing into their night, the friends eventually made their way down to the water, and they went swimming for a while, and they continued to drink down by the dock. And then when they were tired of swimming, the teens just laid on the dock and enjoyed looking out at the sunset. Even though actually in Finland at this time of the year, it's not really a sunset because the sun does not actually fully set. And so when this happens, these are known as white nights, which are very beautiful. I mean, it's kind of like this hazy glow in the sky from the sun not quite setting. And so on this night that the teens are out there on the dock, they had this beautiful, white night to look up at. And for Mela, she felt like this was the perfect birthday celebration. In fact, she would jot down in her diary later that night just how amazing everything was going and how much fun she was having with Nils and their friends. Finally, the teens were done down by the dock, so they grabbed their things, they went back up to the campsite, they dried off, they changed, and then all four of them piled into their one little tent to go to sleep. And eventually, all four of them would drift off to sleep, but then at some point in the middle of the night, Mela woke up. and she heard rustling sounds outside the tent. And so she wondered if, maybe one of the friends had gotten up. And so she sat up and looked out the tent, and she couldn't see anything. She just saw the kind of hazy night sky from the white night, and she couldn't really tell if everybody was inside the tent or not. But then suddenly, a dark, shadowy figure moved in front of the tent flap, the open tent flap. And so this shadowy figure totally blocked all the light that was coming into the tent from the white night. And then this shadowy figure looked into the tent, and they had these bright, glowing red eyes. And before Mela or anybody else in the tent could do anything, there was a snapping sound, and the tent fell down on top of them. The next morning at 6 a.m., two boys who were not in any way connected to these four teenagers were at this lake. They were over to the side doing some fishing, and they were looking kind of out generally in the direction of where the four teenagers had stayed the night before. And this particular day, the lake was not remotely crowded like it was the day before. Basically, it was a ghost town. And suddenly they saw emerge from the forest, basically where the teens had camped, was this young man with blonde hair who was just running away from where that campsite was. And so these boys just stared for a second at this random guy with blonde hair running away from the campsite until the boys lost interest and just went back to fishing. As the morning wore on, more and more people came to the lake, but nobody made their way out to the campsite where the teenagers had been the night before. That is, until a father and his two sons decided to head out that way to go to that dock to go swimming. And so this father and his sons began walking on the same wooded trail that Nils and Seppo had driven their motorcycles on to get out to that camping site, and he eventually makes it to the clearing in the forest where this campsite was, and right away he spots what looks like a crumpled heap of canvas kind of sitting between two trees, and he couldn't really tell what it was. And so the father walked a little bit closer to investigate, and eventually he realized what they were actually walking up on, at which point he threw up a hand to stop his sons from going any closer. And he turned around and he told his kids, "We have to leave right now." And so the father and his sons, they run back up that trail, they find a phone, and they call the police. When the police arrived at the lake just before noon, they would walk out to that campsite and they would see that crumpled heap of canvas, and then also in and around that crumpled heap were the four bodies of the four teenagers who had stayed there the night before. Anja and Seppo had not even made it out of the tent. They had been beaten and stabbed to death basically through the canvas fabric. Mela did manage to get out of the tent, however, she did not escape. She was kind of laying on top of the tent, and she had broken bones, and it would turn out she was stabbed a total of 15 times, and some of those stabs came when she was alive, and some came when she was dead. And then laying next to her was the body of her boyfriend Nils, and he was basically unrecognizable. His head had been beaten to a pulp. As officers descended on the scene and began rifling through the teenagers' backpacks and different belongings, one officer knelt down near all the victims to look more closely at each of their injuries. And as they were looking at each of the victims, they suddenly heard this gasping sound. It's very faint, but they could definitely hear it. And to their shock, Nils, so Mela's boyfriend, he suddenly opened his eyes and he looked up at this officer. He was still alive. And this officer who's seeing this, who was totally convinced Nils was dead, as everybody else was at first unsure what to even do. But then a second later, the officer stood up and began screaming for a medic. After Nils was taken away in an ambulance, the different investigative teams that had descended on the scene began going over the evidence and different things they had found, and pretty quickly, the general feel amongst all the investigators was this crime scene does not make any sense. There were some things missing from the crime scene that seemed to indicate this could have been a robbery, like missing wallets and missing watches. But there were other things that were missing that just didn't really make any sense to have been taken. Like, for example, the two motorcycles that the boys drove in, they were still there, parked up against the tree. But their keys were gone, so why steal the keys and not take the motorcycles? And then also, Nils's prized leather jacket and his shoes were also missing. These were not particularly valuable. I mean, they might have been emotionally valuable to Nils, but they certainly were not valuable enough to warrant a robber, killing people to get their hands on them. So eventually, the police actually called in the military to come into the forest and help with the search. And when the military arrived and began fanning out all around this huge forest, they would make a really big discovery. They would find Nils's shoes. And these shoes were speckled with blood, and it was clear from the bloody tracks nearby that the killer must have, at some point, put these shoes on at the campsite and then walked away while still wearing them, and then ultimately, ditched them 500 meters away underneath that pile of leaves. In the days after the murders, the police chased down dozens of leads all over Finland, but none of them amounted to anything. Nils would actually survive the attack, but his face was so badly damaged with so many broken bones in his head that it took a really long time before he could even speak. But when he finally could and the police were able to interview him, it became immediately clear that Nils did not have a good memory of the attack. And in fact, the day of the attack, basically the whole day, he didn't really remember it. However, Nils would remember one thing. He said during the chaos of the actual attack, he distinctly remembered seeing a dark, shadowy figure with these bright red, glowing eyes. But the police couldn't just go out and look for a dark figure with red eyes, and so instead they just made a note of this and continued their investigation. The only real lead the police got were from those two boys who were fishing out on the lake a day after the murders happened, where they saw that guy with blonde hair running away from where the teens had camped. Now, these two boys didn't know the significance of what they were seeing, but obviously when the news broke about the murders, they recalled seeing that guy right in the area where they now knew, that's where the murders had happened. And so the police created a composite sketch of, what the boys thought they saw, this blonde guy running, and they would send this sketch all over Finland, and they would ask people, to come forward if you've seen this guy. And loads of people immediately came forward and said, yep, I've seen that guy. But it would turn out the police were getting loads of false reports because the sketch looked like lots of men in Finland. So this was not a unique enough sketch, basically. However, there was one tip that came into police that did really stand out. The day after the murders happened, a man named Hans Osman checked into a hospital located about 13 miles away from where the lake was, where the murders happened. And this guy Hans, when he checks into the hospital, he starts complaining of having these really intense stomach pains. But the doctors don't believe him because Hans actually just appears to be very drunk and very aggressive. First of all, he looked exactly like the police composite sketch of the blonde running guy. Like he was that guy. And also, Hans was filthy. He was covered in dirt and mud, and there was all this dirt kind of embedded in his fingernails like he had been digging with his hands. And he also had all these red stains all over his clothes that he refused to explain. And so eventually, one of the doctors called the police, and when the police interviewed Hans, they would discover that he had a history of violence, and he also said he used to be a member of the Nazi Party, and he also was a member of the Russian secret police, and all of this just seemed like a lie, but basically he seemed like a very erratic and unstable person. But Hans had a rock-solid alibi. On the night of the murder, Hans was located in a city about 15 miles away from where the murders happened, at his girlfriend's house with his girlfriend and also his girlfriend's sister and brother-in-law. And so as much as they wanted Hans to be their guy, the police learned, obviously he's not. And this was basically how the entire investigation went. The police would interview over 4,000 people, but despite all that, they still could not figure out who did this. And so slowly, the case went cold. And that was it for 44 years. Lots of theories, but not one suspect. But then, in 2004, prosecutors made a stunning announcement. They said the killer was Nils Gustafsson, the 18-year-old boyfriend of Mela, who was the only one who survived the attack. And the prosecutors pointed to two pieces of evidence to support this theory. The first piece of evidence was there was this woman who was staying out at the lake on the night of the murders, not far from the teenagers' campsite, who remembered overhearing two men really aggressively fighting before the murders ultimately happened. Prosecutors hypothesized that what that woman overheard was Nils and Seppo fighting with each other. That Nils was mad at Seppo about something to do with Nils's girlfriend, Mela. Perhaps he really was upset that it seemed like Mela was flirting with Seppo, and so Nils felt betrayed, but, something was happening there where these two young men were fighting over a girl. In the prosecutor's eyes, this would also explain why Mela had been stabbed so many times. That basically Nils must have been so furious about whatever was happening between Mela and Seppo, and then, his rage took over and he really took it out on his girlfriend. The second piece of evidence the prosecutors used to support this idea that Nils was the killer were Nils's shoes, which were found under those leaves about 500 meters away from their campsite. The prosecutor said there was blood on the shoes, but not in the shoes. And none of the blood that were on these shoes belonged to Nils. And so prosecutors say that shows Nils murdered his friends while wearing his shoes and then, ran away from the campsite and ditched those shoes to hide them, underneath those leaves. And then he came back to the campsite and inflicted those horrible injuries on himself to make it seem like he also had been attacked. So in the end, Nils, 44 years after the fact, got arrested for these murders. And at the time he was arrested, Nils was 62 years old, he was working as a bus driver, and he was married with kids. But at Nils's trial, he absolutely maintained his innocence and did not waver from his story one bit. He basically said, look, I can't remember all the details of that day. I don't remember the attack very well. I don't really know what we did leading up to it, what happened after it. But what I do remember is I saw a dark, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. That's all I remember. And the jury completely believed him, and he was easily acquitted, and in the end, Finland would even give him a huge monetary settlement for his mental suffering. Today, people tell lots of stories about these murders. I mean, the lake itself where this happened, Lake Bodom, is now completely famous for these murders. People go there just to be in the same place where these teens were killed. But a lot of the stories that circulate about these murders are so far-fetched that they just do not seem believable. Like suggesting that the campsite was cursed and that, the ghosts of murdered campers attacked the teens. It just does not seem like a viable theory. Other stories that circulate are really intriguing, but they don't really get you anywhere. Like periodically there's this photo that will circulate on the internet, and it's a picture of the crowd at one of the teens' funerals. And in the middle of this crowd is this guy whose face looks identical to that composite sketch of the running blonde man. And in fact, people have come out and said he looks exactly like that guy, Hans Osman, who had shown up in the hospital, the day after the murders with the dirt and what looked like blood all over him, but he had that alibi. And so that picture makes its rounds on the internet and everybody gets jazzed up and says, there he is, that's the guy who killed the teens. But no one's ever been able to actually identify that person, and so it's gone nowhere. But there is one story that circulates about these murders that a lot of people believe is the truth. When the teenagers were killed, there was a 55-year-old man named Carl Valdemar Gillstrom who lived right on Lake Bodom. And Carl had a reputation for being really nasty and sometimes even lashing out at the campers who stayed in this area. And in fact, Carl would often get drunk and literally go and attack the other campers. He would cut down their tents in the middle of the night, he would throw rocks at their campsite, and then one time, he even fired a gun at a camper who was riding past him on a moped. He missed, but this guy is an absolute nightmare. And so after the murders happened, locals who knew about Carl immediately went to police and they were like, that's the guy who very likely did this. This is totally something he would do. But when police went and tried to speak to Carl, they wound up speaking to Carl's wife, who was the kiosk woman. The woman who was so nasty to the teens when they first arrived and basically told them to get away. Yeah, so the police talked to her, and she would tell police that Carl was with her and her kids when the murders happened. And so the police believed her and never really considered Carl a serious suspect. But in the Lake Bodom area, when people heard he was not being looked at closely, people felt like this was a huge mistake. But 9 years after the murders, so at this point the case is totally cold, Carl is having a drink with his neighbor out near the Lake Bodom area, and as they're just sitting there having drinks, relaxing, Carl winds up admitting to the neighbor that he was the Lake Bodom murderer. He literally said to his neighbor, "Don't you understand that I'm the murderer of Bodom?" And the neighbor apparently was so caught off guard and so horrified by this that they said to Carl, "Well, if that's the truth, you should go drown yourself." And then the next day, where was Carl found? Out in the lake, drowned, right near where the teens had been attacked. Now, the police were never able to actually figure out if his death was accidental, or if he had done it to himself, or if somebody else had done it to him. But that's the story, and lots of people believe that Carl was so racked with guilt over what he had done that he did what his neighbor suggested.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the Mr. Ballen podcast, and there's Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.